The trip into the mountains felt like a step back in time. Dylan had been talking for months about his uncle's cabin, swearing up and down that it was the perfect spot for a getaway. He described it as rustic but cozy, nestled in the Appalachian woods, away from everything. I wasn't sure what I was picturing. Maybe something like the log cabins you see in postcards, warm and inviting with smoke curling out of the chimney. But as the four of us, me, Dylan, Mark, and Jessica, piled into Dylan's truck and headed toward the hills, something in my gut told me it wasn't going to be that kind of place. The drive stretched on for hours, the paved roads turning into winding country lanes, then narrowing into gravel paths, and finally degrading into little more than a dirt trail. Cell service dropped off completely about 40 minutes before we got anywhere near the cabin, just leaving us with the silence of the forest pressing in on both sides. The air felt heavier the higher we climbed, cooler, and yet somehow more suffocating. The kind of silence where you know there are thousands of living things watching, but you can't see any of them. By the time we pulled up, dusk had already settled over the mountains. The cabin stood there, a hulking shape among the trees, more menacing than welcoming. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on vacation brochures. The logs were weathered to near black, the roof sagged in places, and the porch leaned precariously like one good storm could take it down. I remember thinking the windows looked like dark eyes, hollow and watchful. "Here she is," Dylan said proudly as he killed the engine. His enthusiasm felt forced, as if even he knew it didn't look like the kind of place you'd want to spend the night. Still, he tried to keep the mood up, hauling bags out of the back. Mark laughed nervously. "This place looks like it belongs in a horror movie. You sure it's safe? Place like this, I'd be surprised if the floor doesn't cave in." Jessica shivered and rubbed her arms. "It feels colder here than it did down the road." And she was right. The cabin sat in a pocket of chill despite it being mid-July. I tried to brush it off as the elevation, but the unease was already digging under my skin. Inside, the cabin was every bit as primitive as it looked. A stone fireplace sat blackened with soot in the main room, the furniture looked decades old, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. There was no electricity, no running water, just a pump out back and a few oil lamps Dylan found in a cabinet. We settled in as best we could, unrolling sleeping bags on creaky cots. Dylan kept insisting the cabin had character, but the longer we stayed, the more oppressive it felt. It wasn't just the lack of modern conveniences, it was the stillness, the way sound didn't seem to travel right. If you spoke in one room, the words felt muffled, like the walls absorbed them. That first night, after we cooked canned chili over a small fire in the hearth, the uneasiness grew sharper. We were sitting around the firelight, swapping old stories and laughing louder than we probably needed to. But the laughter felt hollow. Then, without warning, something tapped against the far window. We all froze. It wasn't the random creak of wood or the scratch of a tree branch. It was distinct. A sharp, deliberate tap, like a fingernail against glass. Mark chuckled, though his voice was thin. Probably a raccoon or something. But when Dylan checked, shining his flashlight out the window, there was nothing. Just the wall of black trees. We tried to laugh it off, but the mood never recovered. Jessica kept glancing at the windows, and I noticed Dylan was quieter than usual. Around midnight, we all decided to turn in. I woke to scratching. At first, I thought it was mice in the walls, but it was too loud, too purposeful. It came from the front door, like someone dragging their fingernails down the wood. I held my breath and strained to listen. The others were asleep, their breathing soft around the room. Then the sound stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the curtain by my cot, I regretted it immediately. There was someone, something, standing just beyond the porch, barely visible in the moonlight. At first, I thought it was a man. Tall, gaunt, his shoulders unnaturally sharp, his head tilted as if he were studying the cabin. But his proportions were wrong. His arms looked too long, and when he shifted, it was jerky, like a puppet on strings. I ducked back under the covers and squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might wake the others. I didn't sleep again until dawn. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been a dream, maybe a trick of the shadows. But when I stepped outside, the wood of the front door was scarred with fresh grooves, long and deep, as though something had dragged claws across it. I didn't mention it at first, but Jessica noticed too. She pointed out the marks, her face pale. An animal? She asked. Dylan shook his head, frowning. Too clean, too straight. Doesn't look like any bear or cat I've seen. Mark swore under his breath, but none of us had an explanation. We busied ourselves that day with hiking and trying to distract ourselves, but the tension never left. The woods felt alive, but not in the usual way. It felt like they were watching us, closing in tighter the farther we went. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the crunch of our own footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. That night, the tapping came back, louder this time, more insistent. We huddled in the main room, lantern light flickering against the log walls, and listened as the sound moved from window to window. Tap, tap, tap. Always in threes, always slow and deliberate. Dylan grabbed the rifle his uncle kept above the fireplace and stormed outside, shouting into the trees. The rest of us waited, breathless, until he came back pale and shaken. There's nothing out there, he said, nothing I could see. But the look in his eyes told me he'd felt it too, the sense that something had been out there just beyond the light, waiting. The third night broke us. It started with footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate. Then the doorknob rattled, slowly at first, then violently. Jessica screamed, and Mark pressed his shoulder against the door, while Dylan raised the rifle. The door held, but the scratching returned, this time across every wall of the cabin at once, surrounding us. It was like dozens of nails dragging down the logs, circling, faster and louder. My skin crawled, and I felt like I was suffocating. And then, silence. We sat there, frozen, waiting. The fire sputtered, throwing shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then, from the fireplace came a sound I'll never forget. A voice. It was faint at first, like whispers carried down a long tunnel, but it grew clearer. Low, rasping, broken, but unmistakably human. Let me in. Jessica collapsed into tears. Mark cursed under his breath. Dylan kept the rifle trained on the hearth, though what good that would do, I couldn't say. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing in the stone. Let me in. We didn't sleep that night. We huddled together, waiting for dawn, but dawn didn't bring relief. Outside we found new claw marks, deeper this time, nearly gouging through the wood. By the fourth day, none of us wanted to be there. But Dylan insisted we stick it out, said we were imagining things, that fear was getting the best of us. The rest of us knew better, but we were stuck. The nearest town was miles away, the road rough and narrow. That night, whatever it was stopped pretending. I woke to the sound of wood splitting. The window by my cot cracked inward, shards of glass scattering across the floor. Something had thrown itself against the wall, hard enough to nearly break through. We bolted upright, panic taking over. The scratching became pounding, fists or claws slamming against the cabin from every side. The walls shuddered with each impact. The voice roared this time, not a whisper but a guttural, inhuman demand. Let me in, we screamed, cried, begged for it to stop, but there was nothing we could do. Dylan fired the rifle blindly out the broken window, the shots echoing into the night. For a moment, everything stopped. Silence, no pounding, no voice. But then, from the edge of the forest, came laughter. Low, cruel, mocking. None of us slept. At first light, we packed our things and left, abandoning the cabin without a second thought. The drive down the mountain was silent, each of us too shaken to speak. I never went back, and I never will. Dylan tried to act like it hadn't happened, but I could see it in his eyes, that same hollow fear that had taken root in all of us. Sometimes at night, I still hear it, a faint tapping at my window, always in threes, always waiting. Story the end. The first time I laid eyes on the cabin, I felt something stir in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't quite name. It was late afternoon, the sun already sliding behind the dense canopy of Appalachian trees, and the air was thick with that damp, earthy scent that clings to the mountains. I had driven nearly 7 hours from Lexington, following winding roads that narrowed to little more than gravel trails, and by the time I turned down the last stretch, the forest had closed in so tightly around me that the sky seemed to vanish completely. The cabin was old, older than it had looked in the online listing. Its log walls were blackened with age, and the stone chimney leaned just slightly to the right, as though the earth beneath it had shifted over the years. The porch sagged, the wood splintered and gray, and there were two rocking chairs stationed side by side, one tilted forward as if someone had just stood up from it. I sat in my car with the engine running for a full minute, staring at it, wondering if I had made a mistake booking this place for the weekend. I wasn't new to the mountains, but I wasn't exactly seasoned either. I had grown up in Louisville, and though I'd gone on hikes and a few camping trips, I had never been this far into the Appalachians. I'd wanted solitude, quiet, and space away from people for a few days. The rental site had called the cabin historic and rustic, perfect for writers or anyone needing to disconnect from the chaos of modern life. That had sounded ideal. Now, sitting in my car with shadows stretching long across the dirt clearing, it felt more like a warning. Still, I'd paid for it, and I wasn't about to turn back. I killed the engine, grabbed my bag, and walked up the creaking steps. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of pine and moss. When I reached for the handle, I noticed the door wasn't locked. It gave under my touch and swung inward with a long groan. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old smoke. The main room was small, with a stone fireplace against one wall, a threadbare couch, and a wooden table with two mismatched chairs. A loft stretched above with a ladder leading up to it, and to the left was a narrow doorway that led to what I assumed was the bedroom. Everything had that sense of being frozen in time. Quilts faded with age, shelves lined with old jars, a lantern still hanging by the fireplace. At first, I thought it was just my nerves making me uneasy, but the longer I stood there, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't just the smell of age. It was as though the walls themselves were holding on to something. A stillness, a weight, like the silence after someone speaks a terrible secret and the room absorbs it. I busied myself with unpacking. My plan was simple: spend the weekend hiking the trails, reading by the fire, and clearing my head. I wasn't running from anything specific, but I'd been restless for months, caught between jobs and trying to figure out what I wanted out of my life. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, but as night fell, I started to feel less like a guest and more like an intruder. The first sound came just after midnight. I had been lying in bed, staring at the slanted ceiling, the creaks and sighs of the cabin lulling me towards sleep. Then I heard it. A shuffle, soft and deliberate, from the porch outside. My heart kicked hard, and I froze. It was slow, almost dragging, like someone pulling their feet across the wooden boards. I tried to reason with myself. It could have been an animal, a raccoon, maybe a stray dog. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. The night pressed in again, heavy and absolute. I waited another 5 minutes before rolling onto my side, eyes fixed on the thin curtains that covered the window. The pale moonlight was just enough to make out their shape. Then the boards creaked again. 2 distinct steps this time. Slow. Heavy. I sat up, pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever or whatever it was right outside the bedroom window now. I could almost picture someone standing there, watching me through the fabric, close enough that if I reached out, I could touch them. The thought chilled me. I didn't move until the sound faded, as though the person had walked back across the porch and into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The morning brought some relief. Sunlight spilled through the trees, and the cabin didn't feel quite as oppressive. I told myself it had to have been an animal, though a part of me didn't believe it. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the ground for tracks. The dirt was soft from a rain earlier in the week, and I found impressions near the steps. Not paw prints. Shoes. The tread was faint but unmistakable. I felt that stir in my stomach again. That day, I hiked one of the trails a mile down the road. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. Towering oaks and maples, a carpet of ferns, the sound of a creek cutting through the silence. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point I stopped, swearing I heard footsteps behind me, only to turn and see nothing but trees. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking low again, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. The unease I had managed to shake during the day returned, stronger now. I made a fire in the hearth, cooked a simple dinner, and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. When darkness fell, the forest outside seemed to press right up against the glass. I lit the lanterns, their glow weak and flickering, and forced myself into bed. I told myself I wouldn't let my imagination get the better of me again. but the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate, moving from the porch to the side, then around the back. I sat up in bed, every muscle locked, straining to hear. The creaks of the boards gave way to the crunch of leaves, then silence, then creaks again on the other side. I thought about calling someone, but who? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and cell service out here was patchy at best. The rental site hadn't mentioned any caretaker nearby. I felt utterly alone. At some point, the footsteps stopped. I stayed awake until dawn again, eyes burning, heart pounding at every little sound. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. On the porch railing, in the thin layer of dust, were finger marks, long, distinct, as though someone had trailed their hand along the wood while walking past my window. I don't know why I didn't leave then. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe something deeper, some strange pull that kept me tethered there despite my fear. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one, and then pack up in the morning. That evening, the woods grew quieter than before. No crickets, no distant owls, just the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. As I sat by the fire, I thought I heard a low hum, faint and steady, drifting from the trees. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human, low and drawn out, like a tune without words. I stood, straining to hear, but the moment I stepped outside, it stopped. The forest was still, suffocating in its silence. I backed inside and bolted the door. I didn't sleep that night. Sometime after 2 a.m, I heard the ladder to the loft creak. That was when the truth crashed down on me. Whoever had been circling the cabin wasn't outside anymore. They were in. The creak came again, slow, deliberate. My skin went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I sat frozen on the bed, staring at the dark shape of the loft above me, waiting for the sound again. But it never came. The silence stretched on, heavier than anything I had felt before. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the blanket, eyes fixed on the loft. At some point, exhaustion must have taken me from this, because the next thing I remember is waking to pale morning light spilling through the window. The loft ladder was empty, but on the table, right in the center, was something that hadn't been there the night before. A small wooden carving, rough and unfinished, in the shape of a figure with no face. That was when I finally left. I didn't pack. I didn't clean up. I just grabbed my bag and bolted out the door, heart racing as I fumbled with my car keys. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every step, and as I slid behind the wheel, I swore I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the main road, until the cabin was miles behind me, until the sun was high and the world felt alive again. Even then, I couldn't shake the image of that carving, the faceless figure left sitting on the table, as though waiting for me to find it. It's been months since then, but I still dream about the footsteps, the hum, the creak of the ladder in the dark. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, certain I'll see a figure at the end of my bed. And sometimes, when my apartment is quiet and the city outside falls still, I swear I can hear it again, the faint, dragging shuffle of footsteps just outside my door. Story, the end. The first time I laid eyes on the cabin, I felt something stir in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't quite name. It was late afternoon, the sun already sliding behind the dense canopy of Appalachian trees, and the air was thick with that damp, earthy scent that clings to the mountains. I had driven nearly 7 hours from Lexington, following winding roads that narrowed to little more than gravel trails, and by the time I turned down the last stretch, the forest had closed in so tightly around me that the sky seemed to vanish completely. The cabin was old, older than it had looked in the online listing. Its log walls were blackened with age, and the stone chimney leaned just slightly to the right, as though the earth beneath it had shifted over the years. The porch sagged, the wood splintered and gray, and there were 2 rocking chairs stationed side by side, one tilted forward as if someone had just stood up from it. I sat in my car with the engine running for a full minute, staring at it, wondering if I had made a mistake booking this place for the weekend. I wasn't new to the mountains, but wasn't exactly seasoned either. I had grown up in Louisville, and though I'd gone on hikes and a few camping trips, I had never been this far into the Appalachians. I'd wanted solitude, quiet, and space away from people for a few days. The rental site had called the cabin historic and rustic, perfect for writers or anyone needing to disconnect from the chaos of modern life. That had sounded ideal. Now, sitting in my car with shadows stretching long across the dirt clearing, it felt more like a warning. Still, I'd paid for it, and I wasn't about to turn back. I killed the engine, grabbed my bag, and walked up the creaking steps. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of pine and moss. When I reached for the handle, I noticed the door wasn't locked. It gave under my touch and swung inward with a long groan. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old smoke. The main room was small, with a stone fireplace against one wall, a threadbare couch, and a wooden table with two mismatched chairs. A loft stretched above with a ladder leading up to it, and to the left was a narrow doorway that led to what I assumed was the bedroom. Everything had that sense of being frozen in time. Quilts faded with age, shelves lined with old jars, a lantern still hanging by the fireplace. At first I thought it was just my nerves making me uneasy, but the longer I stood there, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't just the smell of age, it was as though the walls themselves were holding on to something. A stillness, a weight, like the silence after someone speaks a terrible secret and the room absorbs it. I busied myself with unpacking. My plan was simple: spend the weekend hiking the trails, reading by the fire, and clearing my head. I wasn't running from anything specific, but I'd been restless for months, caught between jobs and trying to figure out what I wanted out of my life. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, but as night fell, I started to feel less like a guest and more like an intruder. The first sound came just after midnight. I had been lying in bed, staring at the slanted ceiling, the creaks and sighs of the cabin lulling me towards sleep. Then I heard it, a shuffle, soft and deliberate, from the porch outside. My heart kicked hard, and I froze. It was slow, almost dragging, like someone pulling their feet across the wooden boards. I tried to reason with myself. It could have been an animal, a raccoon, maybe a stray dog. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. The night pressed in again, heavy and absolute. I waited another 5 minutes before rolling onto my side, eyes fixed on the thin curtains that covered the window. The pale moonlight was just enough to make out their shape. Then the boards creaked again. 2 distinct steps this time. Slow, heavy. I sat up, pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever, or whatever it was right outside the bedroom window now. I could almost picture someone standing there, watching me through the fabric, close enough that if I reached out I could touch them. The thought chilled me. I didn't move until the sound faded, as though the person had walked back across the porch and into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The morning brought some relief. Sunlight spilled through the trees, and the cabin didn't feel quite as oppressive. I told myself it had to have been an animal, though a part of me didn't believe it. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the ground for tracks. The dirt was soft from a rain earlier in the week, and I found impressions near the steps. Not paw prints, shoes. The tread was faint but unmistakable. I felt that stir in my stomach again. That day, I hiked one of the trails a mile down the road. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, towering oaks and maples, a carpet of ferns, the sound of a creek cutting through the silence. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point I stopped, swearing I heard footsteps behind me, only to turn and see nothing but trees. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking low again, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. The unease I had managed to shake during the day returned, stronger now. I made a fire in the hearth, cooked a simple dinner, and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. When darkness fell, the forest outside seemed to press right up against the glass. I lit the lanterns, their glow weak and flickering, and forced myself into bed. I told myself I wouldn't let my imagination get the better of me again, but the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate, moving from the porch to the side, then around the back. I sat up in bed, every muscle locked, straining to hear. The creaks of the boards gave way to the crunch of leaves, then silence, then creaks again on the other side. I thought about calling someone, but who? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and cell service out here was patchy at best. The rental site hadn't mentioned any caretaker nearby. I felt utterly alone. At some point, the footsteps stopped. I stayed awake until dawn again, eyes burning, heart pounding at every little sound. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. On the porch railing, in the thin layer of dust, were finger marks, long, distinct, as though someone had trailed their hand along the wood while walking past my window. I don't know why I didn't leave then. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe something deeper, some strange pull that kept me tethered there despite my fear. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one, and then pack up in the morning. That evening, the woods grew quieter than before. No crickets, no distant owls, just the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. As I sat by the fire, I thought I heard a low hum, faint and steady, drifting from the trees. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human, low and drawn out like a tune without words. I stood, straining to hear, but the moment I stepped outside, it stopped. The forest was still, suffocating in its silence. I backed inside and bolted the door. I didn't sleep that night. Sometime after 2 a.m, I heard the ladder to the loft creak. That was when the truth crashed down on me. Whoever had been circling the cabin wasn't outside anymore. They were in. The creak came again, slow, deliberate. My skin went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I sat frozen on the bed, staring at the dark shape of the loft above me, waiting for the sound again. But it never came. The silence stretched on, heavier than anything I had felt before. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the blanket, eyes fixed on the loft. At some point, exhaustion must have taken me, because the next thing I remember is waking to pale morning light spilling through the window. The loft ladder was empty. But on the table, right in the center, was something that hadn't been there the night before. A small wooden carving, rough and unfinished, in the shape of a figure with no face. That was when I finally left. I didn't pack. I didn't clean up. I just grabbed my bag and bolted out the door, heart racing as I fumbled with my car keys. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every step, and as I slid behind the wheel, I swore I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the main road, until the cabin was miles behind me, until the sun was high and the world felt alive again. Even then, I couldn't shake the image of that carving, the faceless figure left sitting on the table as though waiting for me to find it. It's been months since then, but I still dream about the footsteps, the hum, the creak of the ladder in the dark. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, certain I'll see a figure at the end of my bed. And sometimes, when my apartment is quiet and the city outside falls still, I swear I can hear it again, the faint, dragging shuffle of footsteps just outside my door. Story the end. The first time I drove into the Appalachian Mountains, I wasn't planning on chasing legends or seeking thrills. I was just looking for a quiet place to get away from the buzz of everyday life. I'd been worn down by long work weeks and a breakup that had left me restless. So when a friend of mine mentioned a cabin rental deep in the hills of western North Carolina, I didn't hesitate. He said it was off the beaten path, but beautiful, with hiking trails right outside the door and enough space between you and the next person that you'd forget other people even existed. At the time, that sounded perfect. The road into the mountains felt like it belonged to another century. My car rattled along old, cracked pavement that narrowed the further I went. Forests grew denser with each mile, their green canopies swallowing the sky, letting only broken streams of sunlight through. I passed maybe 2 houses in the last hour of the drive, both weathered wooden places with peeling paint and porches sagging under years of neglect. By the time the GPS signal disappeared and the road turned into gravel, I started to feel the weight of real isolation. The cabin sat at the end of a long, winding driveway carved out of the hillside. Trees surrounded it on all sides, so thick that from certain angles you couldn't even see the sky. The structure itself looked like it had been there for decades. Log walls, darkened from age and rain, a tin roof with patches of rust, and a porch that leaned ever so slightly to the left. It wasn't unsafe, but it was the kind of place you could tell time had forgotten. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that had probably been updated in the 1980s, and 2 small bedrooms tucked into the back. There was a faint smell of damp wood, like the whole place had absorbed years of Appalachian rain. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a row of old photographs, black and white portraits of unsmiling people in stiff clothes. Their eyes followed you in that way only old photos seem to. There was also a clock up there, round, wooden, with gold hands. I checked the time when I walked in, but it wasn't ticking. The hands were frozen at 2:47. I shrugged it off. Old cabins always had quirks, and honestly, I was glad just to be away from the city. I unpacked a little, made some coffee, and stepped onto the porch to listen. That was the first thing that struck me. The silence. I'd expected birds, maybe the rush of wind through the trees, or the drone of cicadas. Instead, there was nothing but stillness, heavy and unbroken. I told myself it was just the time of day, that maybe I'd hear more as the sun dipped lower. That night, I lit a fire in the hearth, poured myself a drink, and settled down with a book. Around midnight, I heard something, a faint creak, like wood shifting under weight. I assumed it was the porch settling or maybe a raccoon nosing around. But when it came again, louder this time, I froze. It wasn't random. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the porch outside. I held my breath, waiting for a knock at the door or for the footsteps to move away. But they didn't. They stopped directly in front of the door. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved toward the window, but when I shined the beam out, the porch was empty. The rocking chair sitting in the corner, though, was moving, back and forth, slow and steady, as if someone had just stood up from it. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening for the creak of wood. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, only to wake suddenly with the sense that someone was in the room. The air felt charged, colder somehow. My eyes darted to the corner, and for a second I could have sworn I saw a figure there, a shadow darker than the rest of the dark. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on me. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I went hiking on one of the trails, following a narrow path that wound up the ridge. The forest was breathtaking, but it had an odd stillness. No birdsong, no rustling animals, just the crunch of my boots. Halfway up, I stumbled across an old stone foundation, all that remained of what must have been a house long ago. It was overgrown with moss, and the trees had swallowed most of it, but there was something about it that made me pause. Scattered around were pieces of rusted metal, broken glass, and an old, splintered rocking chair lying on its side. I didn't linger. I turned back, uneasy, and the entire way down I felt like someone was walking behind me. The hair on my neck wouldn't settle. More than once I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing. That night, the noises returned. Footsteps on the porch, slow and steady. This time, I didn't move. I stayed frozen in my chair, staring at the door, every muscle tense. The rocking chair outside creaked again, rocking in that same slow rhythm. Then came the tapping. Not at the door, but at the windows. A light, deliberate tap, tap, tap that circled the cabin. First the front window, then the side, then the bedroom. I pulled the curtains closed, but the sound continued, moving from one pane of glass to the next. By 2:47, the exact time the mantel clock was stuck on, everything stopped. The silence returned so suddenly it felt like pressure releasing from my chest. I didn't sleep that night either. The third day, I debated leaving. But something in me, maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity, kept me there. I told myself I'd last one more night, then leave in the morning. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to press in closer. I locked every door and window, lit the fire, and sat waiting. The footsteps came earlier, before midnight. They moved across the porch, paused, then pressed against the door. I swear I saw the wood bow slightly inward, as if weight was leaning against it. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight. Then from outside, I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, like someone was standing inches away on the other side. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the door open and shined the beam straight out. For a split second, I saw something at the edge of the trees. Tall, pale, with shoulders hunched unnaturally and arms that seemed too long. Its head tilted, almost curious, and then it slipped back into the darkness faster than I could register. The rocking chair on the porch rocked wildly, as if someone had pushed it hard, before slowing into its steady rhythm again. I slammed the door and locked it, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear. For the rest of the night, the knocking continued, circling the cabin, always just out of sight. By the time dawn broke, I had made up my mind. I threw everything into my car and didn't even bother to check if I'd left anything behind. The road out felt different, heavier, like the woods didn't want me to leave. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. The silence, the footsteps, the shadow in the room, the thing in the trees, it all swirled together, impossible to explain, but impossible to deny. Even now, back in the city, it hasn't left me. Some nights I wake at exactly 2:47 a.m., heart racing. Sure, I can hear the faint creak of wood rocking in the distance. And sometimes, when I glance out the window in the dark, I swear I see movement. A tall, hunched figure standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight, waiting. Story the end. The sun was just starting to dip behind the ridges of the Appalachians when we pulled off the narrow, winding road onto the gravel driveway leading to the cabin. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and a cool autumn breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and moss. I had come up here with 3 friends, Jake, Lisa, and Marcus, looking for a weekend away from the noise of the city. Marcus's uncle had left him the cabin a few years ago, less tucked away in a remote part of the North Carolina mountains. It was rustic, to say the least. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. A stone fireplace, a rickety wooden table, a few creaky chairs, and a bed frame with a stained mattress in the corner. From the moment we stepped out of the car, I felt that strange, heavy silence you only get deep in the woods. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The windows were grimy and the shutters hung at odd angles, some missing entirely. I tried to shake the unease growing in my gut. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. A break from the city, the stress, the screens. We spent the first afternoon exploring the area, gathering firewood and setting up. The sun slipped behind the mountains fast, and soon the forest darkened to shadows. We built a fire in the stone hearth, its crackling flames the only light inside the cabin. Outside, the night pressed in thick and black, the trees forming an almost impenetrable wall around us. As night deepened, the forest sounds changed. The birds quieted, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. But there was something else. A faint whistle, soft and slow, coming from somewhere out there in the dark. It wasn't the whistle of any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost deliberate, a melody of 3 notes repeated again and again, carried on the cool night wind. Jake, ever the skeptic, joked it was just some guy out hunting, maybe trying to signal to his buddies. But Marcus frowned. My uncle used to say people don't whistle in these woods at night, he said quietly, his voice low. That kind of whistle, it's a warning. Lisa shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. Warning of what? I wanted to tell her it was nothing, just our minds playing tricks after a long day in unfamiliar woods. But the whistle came again, rising and falling in the stillness, closer this time. We all froze, listening. The firelight flickered, shadows dancing on the log walls. Then, from outside, came a soft tap on the cabin door. Jake stood and grabbed a flashlight. I'll check it out. He swung the door open and shone the beam into the darkness, a best task, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of anyone. The whistle stopped. Still, none of us could sleep well that night. I kept hearing faint sounds, the creak of branches scraping the cabin roof, the occasional low rustle in the underbrush. Every time I thought I heard footsteps just outside the window, I'd pull the covers tighter and tell myself it was the wind. The next morning, the mood was tense. Lisa claimed she'd seen something moving just beyond the tree line, a dark figure watching us. But Jake said it was probably just a deer or some other animal. We ate breakfast quietly, the unease settling like a stone in my chest. We decided to hike a little, to clear our heads. Marcus led us along a narrow trail that twisted up the mountainside. The forest was dense here, the trees thick with moss and the ground littered with fallen leaves and tangled roots. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of pine. About an hour into the hike, we came across an old, broken-down shack, its roof sagging and walls half collapsed. Something about it felt wrong. The door hung open on rusty hinges, and inside the shadows were deep and unsettling. Marcus said his uncle had warned him to stay away from the old shack. Some say it was a moonshine still back in the day, he said. Others say it's cursed. Lisa shivered again, backing away. I don't want to be here anymore. On our way back, the trail seemed to close in on us. The forest grew quieter, the stillness heavier. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me, though no one was there. That night, the whistle returned, louder, more insistent. It circled the cabin, echoing through the trees. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and making the branches tap against the roof like fingers. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, pacing just outside the cabin walls. Marcus grabbed the old hunting rifle from the corner. Stay inside. Don't open the door. We huddled together, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin again and again, never stopping. The whistle wove through the darkness like a thread pulling at the edges of our sanity. Suddenly there was a knock. Soft at first, then louder, urgent. Jake shone the flashlight out the window. For a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale, eyes black and unblinking, reflected in the glass. We all screamed and pulled away. The knocking stopped. The footsteps retreated into the night. The whistle faded with the dawn. When morning came, we found something we couldn't explain. Hanging from the trees all around the cabin were dozens of crude figures made from sticks and twine, swaying silently in the breeze. Some were small, like dolls. Others were human-sized, twisted and grotesque. Marcus looked pale. This isn't the work of kids, he whispered. It's a warning. We need to leave. We packed hurriedly and left, the forest behind us seeming to close once more around the cabin and its secrets. I never went back, and I never will. Story, the end. The first thing you notice about the Appalachian Mountains when you drive up there isn't the sweeping views or the dense forest, though those are impressive. It's the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that creeps under your skin. The kind that makes your ears ring because you realize how absent of sound the whole world can be. That's what hit me first when my friends and I pulled off the cracked asphalt onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. I'd been itching for an escape from city life. Weekends blurred into weeks, working 60 hours at a tech job, and the noise of the streets and the relentless hum of fluorescent lights had worn me down. When my buddy Ryan mentioned his family's cabin out in the Appalachians, I jumped at the chance. Ryan's family owned a small patch of land deep in the woods of North Carolina, passed down for generations, with an old log cabin that hadn't changed much since the 1930s. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. The perfect place to unplug and just breathe. Ryan drove with his girlfriend Abby and our other friend Sam packed into the Jeep. The roads turned from paved to gravel and then to rough dirt paths winding between towering pines and oaks. As we drove deeper into the forest, the temperature dropped noticeably and the sunlight filtering through the canopy became dimmer. By the time we arrived, the sun was just a faint glow behind the peaks, and the forest was bathed in a twilight blue. The cabin itself was a modest one-story structure with weathered logs blackened by decades of rain and smoke from the stone chimney. The roof sagged slightly, covered in a patchwork of moss and pine needles. A small porch jutted out, its wooden boards creaking under our boots. It looked like it belonged in a history book, but with the unmistakable feeling that time had left it behind for good reason. We unloaded our gear, unpacked some food, and built a fire in the hearth. The air inside smelled of dry wood and a faint musk of mildew, but it was cozy enough. The only light came from the flickering flames and our lanterns. We laughed and joked around, trying to ignore the uneasy sensation settling in the pit of my stomach. The first night passed with only minor disturbances. The usual forest sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the faint snap of twigs, kept the darkness from feeling too oppressive. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was as if the forest itself was alive in a way I didn't understand, waiting and silent. The next day, Ryan suggested a hike to a nearby creek that he used to fish in as a kid. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and twisted steeply down the mountain. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. The forest around us seemed almost unnaturally still. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, just silence that pressed against our ears. When we reached the creek, the water was crystal clear but icy cold. We sat on the rocks, skipping stones and enjoying the peace. But then, from somewhere upstream, a faint whistling began. It was slow and deliberate, a melody of 3 notes repeated over and over. None of us recognized the tune, but it felt familiar in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Ryan frowned. That's weird. Nobody's around for miles. We all listened, but the whistling stopped as quickly as it had started. Abby looked uneasy. Maybe someone's out hunting? Maybe, Sam said, but his voice was uncertain. That night was when things began to unravel. As the fire died down, a cold wind swept through the trees, rattling the shutters and sending a chill through the cabin. We sat in silence, wrapped in blankets, listening to the night sounds. Then the whistling returned, closer this time, right outside the cabin. It was slow and low, 3 notes, repeated, drifting just beyond the porch. The sound wasn't natural, it was deliberate, like someone trying to get our attention. Probably a prank, Ryan said, grabbing a flashlight. I'll check it out. He stepped outside, the light beam cutting through the dark. The forest loomed, black and impenetrable. The beam swept over twisted trees and tangled underbrush, but nothing stirred. Hello? Ryan called, his voice echoing faintly. No answer. He took a few cautious steps down the porch, then the whistling stopped abruptly. He came back inside, shrugging it off, but I noticed the way his hands trembled just slightly. The rest of the night was restless. Every now and then, we heard faint footsteps circling the cabin, slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing just beyond the edge of the firelight. Sometimes there were soft taps on the wooden walls, like fingernails scratching. The animals that should have been out there were eerily silent. At one point, Abby claimed she saw a shadow flit past the window, but when we all looked, there was nothing but the waving branches. The next morning, the unease had deepened. I found something strange on the porch, a bundle of sticks tied together with strips of cloth hanging from a low branch like a crude doll. Ryan looked grim. That's not normal. My uncle used to say people left those kinds of things out here as warnings. Warnings for what? Abby asked. Ryan shrugged, but his face was pale. As the day wore on, we discovered more of these figures, some hanging from trees, others leaning against rocks or propped up along the trail. They were made of twigs, leaves, and scraps of fabric, some small enough to fit in your hand, others nearly human-sized. All of them were weathered and covered in moss like they'd been here a long time. We tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. The forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive. That night, the whistling was relentless. It moved around the cabin in an eerie pattern, sometimes close enough to hear the breath behind it, sometimes fading away only to return louder. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin, always slow and measured. We stayed inside, huddled near the fire, too scared to open the door. At one point, the whistling was accompanied by a faint tapping on the window. We looked up and saw a figure, pale and shadowy, standing just beyond the glass, face obscured. We all froze. Then it vanished. The rest of the night was a nightmare of noises, scratching, thudding, and the constant, haunting whistle. We barely slept. By dawn, none of us spoke. We packed quickly, throwing gear into the Jeep and starting the engine. As we drove away, I looked back once to see the cabin standing alone in the clearing, the dark forest pressing in all around it. I don't know what was in those woods or what it wanted, but I know one thing. Some places in the Appalachians aren't meant for visitors, and some warnings are better heeded. Story the end. The late afternoon sun was already slipping behind the dense canopy of the Appalachian Mountains when we finally reached the gravel road that would take us to the cabin. Casey was behind the wheel of his beat-up pickup, his voice light but tinged with excitement as he promised a weekend free from the distractions of city life. Me, Casey, Mark, and Lisa, 4 friends who hadn't spent much time together since college, had decided to take a trip deep into the mountains to this old family cabin Casey's uncle owned. It was supposed to be rustic, peaceful, and disconnected, the kind of place where you could find clarity in the quiet. The further we drove down the winding road, the more isolated everything became. Cell phones lost signal halfway there, and the radio only picked up static and occasional bursts of distant mountain music. Trees on either side crowded in close vet, their gnarled roots clutching the earth as the narrow road curved tighter and tighter. Somewhere off in the distance, a hawk cried, its scream sharp against the hum of the truck. By the time we pulled off onto the dirt driveway, the sun was a thin orange smear behind the hills. The cabin itself appeared suddenly, a squat silhouette against the darkening sky. It was made of heavy logs, blackened and cracked with age, the roof sagging slightly as if weighed down by the years. The porch was rickety, the steps uneven and worn, and the windows were dark, clouded with grime and shadow. Casey jumped out, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Welcome to paradise," he said, though even he looked a little uncertain as he glanced up at the cabin. We followed him inside, the door creaking ominously on its hinges. The air inside smelled of damp wood and dust, the floorboards rough underfoot. There was a fireplace at one end, cold and empty, with a stack of firewood piled nearby. A few oil lamps sat on a table, waiting to be lit once the sun disappeared completely. There was no electricity, no running water, just a pump outside and outhouse down the hill. The first few hours passed with a kind of nervous energy. We unpacked, lit a fire, and tried to relax. The cabin felt like it belonged in a different time, and the silence was thick, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs outside and the crackle of the fire. As darkness fell, the forest outside seemed to close in tighter. The windows were dark, reflecting flickering flames back at us like watchful eyes. We told stories, laughed a little too loudly, trying to dispel the sense that something was watching from just beyond the glass. That night, lying in my sleeping bag, I was startled awake by a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the window, but it came again. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window right beside me. I held my breath and listened. The tapping stopped. When I dared to look, the moonlight cast long shadows across the yard. Nothing was there, just the dark outline of trees. The next day, Mark found strange scratch marks on the doorframe, thin, jagged lines too long and deep to be from a wild animal. Despite the growing unease, we spent the day hiking, the forest eerily silent around us. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The trail led to an old, collapsed shack, half swallowed by vines and moss, its wood rotten and warped. There were footprints nearby, small, uneven, and with toes too long to be human. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere grew heavier. That night, the tapping returned, louder and moving from window to window, and, beneath it, a low, guttural whisper, "Let me in." We barricaded the door, but the scratching grew frantic, pounding like fists against the walls. The fire flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The voice came again, rising into a harsh, desperate howl. When dawn broke, the damage was clear. Deep gouges in the logs, shattered glass, and claw marks smeared across the porch steps. We left without looking back, the woods seeming to watch as we disappeared down the mountain road. Even now, sometimes late at night, I swear I hear 3 slow knocks at my window, waiting. Story the end. The sun was dipping below the ridges of the Appalachian Mountains as I pulled off the narrow, winding road onto the gravel driveway of the cabin. The air was thick with the musky scent of damp earth and pine needles, a smell that seemed ancient and untouched by modern life. I was here for a weekend getaway, just me and the silence of the mountains, a break from the relentless noise of the city. The cabin had been advertised as a rustic retreat, isolated and off the grid, the perfect place to disconnect. As I stepped out of my truck, the last rays of daylight filtered through the tall trees, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed with the breeze. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, made of weathered logs darkened by years of rain and sun. The porch creaked underfoot as I set my bags down, the wooden boards warped and uneven. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly sour, like mildew. The windows were grimy, filtering the fading light into dull, gray pools on the floor. The furniture was sparse and heavy, made of rough-hewn wood that looked handmade generations ago. There was a fireplace, cold and empty, and a stove in the corner that looked like it hadn't been used in months. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The place was powered by a generator the owners said sometimes failed. I shrugged, dropped my bags by the door, and went to open the windows for fresh air. Outside, the forest was growing dark and dense, the trees merging into a wall of shadows. The sound of crickets and distant owls filled the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves. As night fell, I built a fire in the fireplace, the flames licking the cold stones and sending dancing shadows across the walls. I sat back in a creaky chair, savoring the warmth and the quiet, feeling a strange mix of peace and unease. The kind of feeling like you're being watched, but you can't quite see who or what. Around midnight, the fire was dying down, and I was starting to feel the weight of solitude pressing on me. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping at the window behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, flashlight raised. The glass was fogged with condensation, but I could just make out a shape, something standing outside, just beyond the edge of the porch light. I called out, my voice cracking, but the figure didn't move or answer. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate, like someone trying to get my attention without making a sound. I stepped closer, trying to see through the dark. Suddenly, the figure darted back into the woods, swallowed by the shadows. I strained to hear, but only the whisper of the wind stirred the branches. My skin prickled, and I locked the windows and doors, double-checking the old bolts and rusty locks. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, or maybe a local kid playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Later that night, as I lay in the creaky bed, the wind picked up outside, howling through the trees like a chorus of mournful voices. I heard footsteps again, soft and slow, circling the cabin just outside the walls. The wooden floor creaked faintly, as if someone was pacing the porch. I sat up, heart racing, listening. Then came the whispers, indistinct like voices carried on the wind, just beyond comprehension. They seemed to say my name, or maybe it was a warning. The fire sputtered and died, candles flickered and went out, the darkness was complete. In that silence, I felt a cold breath on my neck, and a voice whispered clear and low, "Leave." I bolted upright, shining my flashlight wildly, but the cabin was empty. Only the shadows danced in the firelight. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a kitchen knife, listening to the woods around me. By dawn, the fog had rolled in thick and white, covering the clearing like a shroud. Outside, I found footprints around the cabin, barefoot, small, and pale, too small for any adult. They circled the cabin repeatedly, ending abruptly at the edge of the woods. I left as soon as the sky brightened, driving down the winding mountain road with a growing sense of dread. The locals later told me stories about the cabin, how it was built on sacred ground, cursed by those who had died there long ago. Others vanished after staying there, never to be seen again. I never returned. Story the end. The sky was bruised purple as I rounded the last bend of the narrow mountain road, the dense trees crowding in close on either side like silent sentinels. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as I pulled up to the cabin. It stood at the edge of a clearing, the structure looking almost swallowed by the thick Appalachian forest surrounding it. Weathered wood, darkened by years of rain and moss, made it blend into the landscape like a natural extension of the mountain itself. I could see the outline of the chimney, stone and sturdy despite its age, smoke curling lazily into the cold evening air. I wasn't alone. My two friends, Mike and Sarah, had driven in from Atlanta to join me for a weekend getaway, a break from the city, from the relentless buzz of life. The cabin was a last-minute find, tucked away in some obscure local listing, promising isolation and a chance to disconnect. No cell reception, no internet, just the raw wilderness and a place to sleep. The price was suspiciously low, but desperation and the lure of quiet had pushed us to ignore that. As I cut the engine, the sudden silence was overwhelming. The absence of noise, the city's roar, even birdsong, felt unnatural. Mike and Sarah climbed out, stretching after the long drive, and we unloaded the car. The porch creaked underfoot, and the door gave way with a reluctant groan when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of damp pine and old wood smoke. Cobwebs stretched like thin silk between the beams, and the furniture was sparse, a rough-hewn table, a few chairs, a sagging sofa with threadbare cushions. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, ashes still cold in the grate. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and the single gas lantern flickered weakly as I lit it. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the floors creaked underfoot like the cabin was sighing with age. It was exactly what we'd hoped for, in a grim, weathered kind of way. After setting down our gear, we decided to explore the surrounding woods. The trailhead was just beyond the clearing. a narrow path disappearing into towering oaks and dense undergrowth. The sun was slipping below the ridge, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted between the trees. As we walked, the forest closed around us, the canopy so thick that twilight seemed to settle instantly. The air was cooler here, sharper, and carried a scent of wet earth and pine needles. Mike, ever the adventurer, led the way confidently, his flashlight bobbing ahead. Sarah and I trailed behind, voices hushed, ears alert to every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. The deeper we went, the heavier the silence became, broken only by our footsteps. At one point, I thought I saw movement, something pale, a flicker of light reflecting off eyes just beyond the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. We turned back as darkness fully swallowed the trail. The cabin's windows glowed faintly in the gathering night, a beacon in the vast wilderness. That night, the forest seemed alive with sounds we didn't recognize. Low moans carried on the wind had the distant cracking of branches, something skittering just beyond sight. Inside, we huddled around the fireplace, the flames casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Sarah nervously joked about mountain ghosts and old legends, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Mike tried to lighten the mood, but even his laugh sounded hollow. Just after midnight, when the fire was low and the room chilled, I was woken by a noise, a soft tapping on the window near the hearth. My breath caught. I sat up, listening intently. Tap, 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 tap. There it was again, slow and deliberate. I shook Mike awake, but when we both looked out, there was nothing but the black forest beyond the glass. We tried to convince ourselves it was an animal, a branch brushing against the window, but the knocking continued intermittently throughout the night. When dawn finally broke, casting pale light through the broken shutters, we discovered scratches on the outside wood, long, jagged gouges that looked like claws. The journal we found the next day gave some eerie context. Tucked behind a loose stone in the hearth, bound in cracked leather and filled with fading ink, it belonged to the previous occupant. The entries spoke of watchers in the woods, shadows that waited just beyond the tree line, eyes that followed every movement. The writer's scrawl grew frantic toward the end, mentioning the children with hollow faces, and a warning to ever trust the night. As the weekend went on, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. At night, the forest pressed closer to the cabin, and strange noises echoed in the darkness. Whispers, footsteps circling the clearing, and the occasional chilling scream that pierced the silence. Our nerves frayed, sleep became impossible. On the final night, we decided to leave before dawn. As we packed in the heavy darkness, the knocking returned, this time pounding violently on every window and door. The sound was deafening, urgent, like a warning or a demand. Heart pounding, we scrambled into the car, tires spinning on the loose gravel as we sped away from the cabin, the mountains swallowed in shadow behind us. The experience left a permanent scar on my mind. Every now and then, when the wind howls just right or the night grows too silent, I swear I can hear that tapping, and I wonder if the watchers are still out there waiting in the woods of the Appalachians. Story. The end. The late afternoon sun was sinking behind the mountains as we turned off the main road and onto the narrow, winding gravel path that led deep into the heart of the Appalachians. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as the trees closed in on both sides of the lane. Towering oaks and pines so dense their shadows pooled thick and dark on the road. The air felt cooler here, heavier with the scent of damp earth and moss. We were three friends, me, Josh, and Claire. All of us city kids, used to the noise and bright lights of Atlanta, craving an escape into nature. The cabin we'd rented was an old log structure, deep in the mountains, miles from any town or cell service. The listing promised solitude and rustic charm, exactly what we wanted to disconnect for a few days. The GPS lost signal long before we reached our destination, and when we finally saw the cabin, it sat there like a relic from another time, its weathered logs stained dark by years of rain and cold. A stone chimney rose crookedly on one side, smoke drifting faintly from it, even though the listing had said it was unoccupied. The porch sagged on one side, with a few rocking chairs that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Josh laughed nervously as we parked, saying it looked like a perfect horror movie set. Claire and I exchanged uneasy looks, but tried to keep the mood light. We unloaded our gear, noting how the surrounding forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No bird song, no insects, just a deep, heavy silence. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The furniture was sparse and old, a rickety table, mismatched chairs, and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. The windows were thick with grime, letting in only slivers of fading light. There was no electricity, and the only light came from the small lantern Josh had brought. We unpacked quickly and decided to explore the small clearing around the cabin. The forest was dense, trees close enough that we could barely see beyond them. As we walked, I felt an unshakable sense that we were being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I caught only shifting shadows, but the feeling remained. That evening, after a simple dinner cooked over the fireplace, we settled into the cabin's single bedroom. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and making the cabin creak. As I lay in the darkness, I thought I heard whispering, faint voices just beyond the walls, unintelligible but insistent. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks. The next morning, Claire discovered a journal hidden under a loose floorboard near the hearth. The leather cover was cracked and dusty, and the pages inside were yellowed and brittle. The entries dated back over 50 years and belonged to a man named Henry, who'd lived alone in the cabin for decades. His writing was rambling but mentioned strange happenings, footsteps outside at night, shadows that moved against the trees, and sometimes the feeling of eyes on him. One entry was particularly chilling, describing a group of children with pale faces and dark eyes who appeared near the edge of the forest, watching silently but never speaking. Henry's final entries grew more desperate, ending abruptly after a mention of the Watchers coming closer. That day, as we hiked one of the trails leading up the ridge, the forest grew darker and colder. I kept seeing movement in the corner of my vision, fleeting glimpses of figures standing motionless between the trees. Josh tried to joke it off as deer or stray dogs, but even he looked unsettled. Back at the cabin that night, the knocking started. Slow and deliberate at first, 3 knocks on the door, then the windows. We sat frozen, heartbeats pounding, unable to make sense of the sound. When Josh finally mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing but the thick, dark woods. The next morning, we found deep scratches gouged into the wood near the front door, and strange elongated footprints circling the cabin. Some looked adult-sized, others small, like children's feet, but all had toes splayed unnaturally wide. By the 3rd night, sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. The knocking returned, louder and more frantic. The air inside the cabin grew cold and heavy, and I could swear I saw pale faces pressed against the window panes, eyes dark and empty, watching us. When we finally fled at dawn, the woods seemed to close behind us, swallowing the cabin from view. Even now, months later, the images haunt me. The pale watchers, the footprints, the relentless knocking echoing in the night. I'll never forget the cabin in the Appalachians. Some places are better left alone. Story the end. The road narrowed as we wound deeper into the heart of the Appalachians, the towering pines crowding in from both sides, their dark green needles whispering secrets in the chilly breeze. It was late afternoon, and the sunlight filtered dimly through the thick canopy, casting mottled shadows on the cracked, overgrown dirt track. Our truck's tires crunched on loose gravel and fallen leaves as my friends and I made our way toward a cabin that seemed forgotten by time, a place none of us really knew, except by a few old family stories and a hastily scribbled map Jake had pulled out of his grandfather's attic. Jake was the kind of guy who loved a good story, especially the ones that gave him a chill. When he found out about this cabin, he said it had been abandoned for decades, way up in the mountains where cell phones barely worked, if at all. Perfect place to get off the grid, he told us. Perfect place to get away from everything, away from the noise, for a weekend at least. We were 4, me, Jake, Rachel, and Mike, college buddies who'd been looking for some kind of adventure to break the routine. We'd brought some supplies, a little food, a few beers, and our hiking gear. What we didn't bring was the sense that whatever lived in these woods wasn't just wild animals or the creaks of an old cabin settling in the cold night. When we finally pulled off the main road, the path to the cabin was barely visible, more a trail than a road. Trees leaned in close, their branches scraping the roof as we crept forward. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, mixed with the faint tang of smoke from a distant fire, though we saw no other signs of life. Jake slowed the truck to a crawl, eyes sharp as he scanned the thick woods. After what felt like an eternity, the cabin emerged through the trees. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 by 30 feet, built of heavy, dark logs that had weathered decades of rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly in the center, and patches of moss clung to the shingles. A porch wrapped around the front, its wooden boards cracked and bowed, with an old rocking chair sitting empty in one corner. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was like the woods themselves held their breath. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling, just the distant echo of the wind threading through the trees. We unloaded our gear, careful to step lightly on the porch, which creaked under our weight. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold wood and something else, something faintly metallic and sour. Dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the grimy windows, coating everything in a thin gray film. The fireplace was filled with cold ashes, and the furniture was sparse: a rickety table, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a bed frame with a thin, lumpy mattress. Rachel wrinkled her nose. "This place hasn't been touched in years." "Exactly why it's perfect," Jake said, grinning. "No distractions. Just us in the woods." We got a fire going in the hearth, the smoke curling up the chimney and out into the fading day. The warmth chased away some of the damp chill that clung to the cabin's walls. We ate sandwiches and passed around a bottle of whiskey, swapping stories and laughing, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept under my skin. Night fell fast in the mountains. Darkness spilled in through the windows like ink, and the forest outside became a black wall, impenetrable and alive. We took turns watching the fire and checking the perimeter outside, but every time someone stepped out, they came back looking shaken, like the woods were watching them back. Around midnight, the noises started. At first, it was a faint scratching at the back wall, like nails on wood, then a slow, heavy thudding on the porch floor, deliberate and rhythmic. We gathered around the fire, trying to convince ourselves it was just an animal or the old cabin settling, but the sounds kept coming, closer, circling the house. Mike swore he saw a figure moving just beyond the tree line, a shadow that slipped between the trees faster than any person should. Rachel said she heard whispers, soft and urgent, but none of us could make out what they said. Then came the knocks, 3 sharp raps at the door, followed by silence. We all froze. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for the rusty bolt. The knocks came again, slower this time, like someone trying to get in, patient and unmoving. We backed away, pulling the curtains tight, but the pounding continued all night, at the windows, on the walls, on the roof. When dawn finally cracked through the canopy, the forest went silent once more. We didn't sleep. We packed up as fast as we could and left, our hearts pounding with every step back down the trail. The cabin faded behind us, swallowed by the trees and shadows. But sometimes when the wind howls through my apartment windows, I still hear those knocks, and I wonder if whatever was out there followed us home. Story the end. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a worn dirt path winding through thick Appalachian woods, the kind of place where the trees seemed to crowd in close, blocking out sunlight even in the middle of the afternoon. The deeper we drove, the quieter everything got, until all that was left was the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional rustle of unseen animals in the underbrush. My friend Casey had promised this would be a weekend to remember, a chance to escape the city noise and digital distractions. He claimed his uncle's cabin was tucked away in the heart of the mountains, a perfect place to unwind and reconnect with nature. I'd been skeptical at first, but when the others, Mark, Lisa, and I, agreed, it felt like the right time to do something different. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping behind the tree-covered peaks, casting long shadows that pooled in the hollows between trunks. The cabin was a squat, weathered log structure, its dark wood stained by years of rain and wind. The porch sagged under the weight of age, and the windows were clouded with grime. Smoke lazily drifted from the crooked chimney, promising warmth inside. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, sharp and clean, but there was an oddness to it, an undercurrent that made my skin prickle. Something about this place felt off. Inside, the cabin was cramped but serviceable. A heavy wooden table sat in the middle of the main room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet. The fireplace was cold, but dry wood was stacked nearby. There was no electricity, no outlets, no lights, just a small collection of lanterns and candles. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall swallowed the mountains whole. Casey busied himself lighting a fire, the glow pushing back shadows that seemed to cling stubbornly to every corner. As darkness fell, the forest outside became a dense, impenetrable black. We gathered around the fire, talking quietly over the crackle of flames, stories, laughter, the comforting buzz of companionship. But beneath it all, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching us. That night, the wind rose suddenly, whistling through the cracks in the cabin's walls. It tugged at the curtains, made the trees scrape and groan. Somewhere outside, an animal howled, a long, mournful sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, staring at the rough wooden ceiling. The forest pressed in so close it felt like it was breathing around us. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate tapping on the window nearest my bed. At first, I thought it was a branch caught in the wind, but the tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, methodical. I held my breath and listened. Tap, 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 tap. It didn't stop. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered out through the grime-coated glass. Nothing. Just the blackness of the woods, twisting and shifting in the moonlight. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The others were asleep, their steady breathing a small comfort. The next morning, we joked about it. Some kind of animal, probably. But none of us could explain the strange marks on the windowsill. Long, thin scratches, almost like fingernails had scraped across the wood. Casey brushed it off, though I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. We decided to hike the nearby trails, trying to chase the unease from our minds. The woods were eerily silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the crunch of our boots on the leaf litter. Halfway through, Mark stopped and pointed to the ground. There were footprints, barely visible but unmistakably human. Small, with long toes, like nothing we'd ever seen. They led deeper into the forest, toward a narrow ravine that cut between the trees. We debated following them, but turned back, the silence growing heavier. That night, the tapping returned, but this time it was joined by something else, a low, guttural growl from just outside the cabin. We gathered by the fire, nerves raw. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as though someone, or something, was trying to force it open. Mark grabbed the rifle Casey's uncle had left behind. The knocking stopped. Silence fell again. Then, from the fireplace, a whisper. "Let me in." The words were faint, breathy, but unmistakably there. We stared at each other, the firelight flickering against our pale faces. The next morning, we found deep gouges along the front door, long scratches that tore through the wood. No animal we knew could have done that. The cabin seemed to close in on us. The walls creaked as if alive. At night, shadows moved where there should be none. On the last night, the tapping turned into pounding. Fists or claws beat against the cabin from all sides. The voice returned, louder, desperate. "Let me in." We barricaded ourselves inside until dawn. When the sun finally rose, we packed without a word. As we drove away, the trees seemed to lean closer, watching. And even now, long after that weekend, I sometimes hear the tapping. 3 slow knocks on the window. Waiting. Story the end. The sun was already dipping behind the ridges when we pulled off the narrow mountain road onto the gravel driveway. The headlights cut through the thickening shadows, illuminating the towering pines and the old cabin that sat tucked just beyond the edge of the clearing. The place was exactly what Mark had promised. Remote, rustic, and untouched by the modern world. It was the kind of place people didn't come to unless they were looking to get lost, either on purpose or by accident. We'd driven nearly 8 hours from Atlanta, all 4 of us packed into Mark's aging pickup truck, the air inside thick with a mix of anticipation and fatigue. The summer heat was already starting to give way to the cool mountain air, a welcome relief after the sticky humidity of the city. Claire, who usually had the sharpest nerves among us, was unusually quiet, her eyes flicking nervously toward the dark tree line as we stepped out and stretched our legs. The cabin was a squat 2-story structure made of weathered logs that had faded to a dull gray. The porch sagged slightly under the weight of years, and a single rusted lantern hung crookedly beside the front door. The windows were grimy and clouded. the kind of dirt that only years of neglect can produce. We all felt the weight of the silence settling in as we unloaded our bags. Mark flicked the breaker box on the porch, but nothing happened. No lights, no hum of a generator. The power was out and likely had been for some time. "Well, that's rustic for you," he said with a half smile, waving us inside. The cabin's interior was dim and cool. The wood floorboards creaked underfoot, and the air smelled of damp earth and stale smoke. Dust motes floated in the shafts of fading sunlight that found their way through the cracked windows. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, cold and empty, and a small kitchen with a rusty sink and an old wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. We claimed rooms upstairs. Mark and Jason took one side, Claire and I the other. The bedrooms were cramped, furnished with thin mattresses on creaky frames, and the windows were barred by thick wooden shutters nailed shut. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. That night, after a quick dinner of canned chili and stale bread, we gathered around a small campfire outside. The mountain air was crisp and smelled of pine and moss. We tried to joke, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. But no one laughed much, and the shadows of the trees seemed to lean closer, as if listening. When we turned in for the night, the darkness inside the cabin felt almost suffocating. The weak light of our flashlights barely penetrated the rooms. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin settling in the silence. But then came the sounds that didn't belong, soft, slow footsteps overhead, pacing back and forth, stopping just above our heads. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered from her bed. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, but even he sounded unsure. The footsteps continued, deliberate and unrelenting, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. Sometimes they would stop, and for a moment the silence was heavier than before, like the cabin itself was waiting. We stayed up until dawn, taking turns to watch the shadows creep through the windows. None of us could sleep. The next day, trying to shake off the restless night, we set out to explore the woods. The trail wound uphill, twisting through thick stands of fir and spruce. The mountain was alive with bird song and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement just beyond sight, a flicker of dark shapes slipping behind the trees. Jason swore he saw a figure watching us from a distance, but when we stopped to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, the trail ended at the ruins of an old homestead, a stone foundation half swallowed by roots and moss. The remnants of a hearth lay cold in the center, and broken glass from a long-gone window glittered faintly in the dying light. We made our way back to the cabin as the sun sank lower, casting the forest in deep, shifting shadows. That evening, the cabin felt colder, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the chill from outside. We huddled close to the fireplace, trying to coax a fire to life with dry twigs and kindling, but the flames struggled and sputtered, never really catching. Then came the whispering. It was barely audible at first, like the murmur of a breeze through leaves. But it grew steadily louder, filling the rooms with low, incomprehensible voices that seemed to crawl under the skin. The words were old, ancient, and incomprehensible, the kind of sound that sets your teeth on edge. Claire began to shake, whispering that we needed to leave. I agreed, but Mark insisted we stay, convinced there was a reasonable explanation: wildlife, the wind, pranksters from the nearby town. As the night deepened, the footsteps returned, louder and more aggressive. They pounded above us, accompanied by a scratching noise like nails raking across wood. The cabin shuddered, and the windows rattled in their frames. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, cold air rushing in like a living thing. Our fire was extinguished in an instant, plunging us into darkness. The scratching moved around the cabin, circling us, coming from every direction. Panic set in as the voices grew into a cacophony of frantic whispers and low growls. Jason grabbed a lantern and rushed outside, shouting into the night, but no one answered. The forest remained silent, the shadows unbroken. Inside, Claire collapsed into tears, and I felt a deep, primal fear clawing at my throat. By dawn, the noises stopped. The air warmed again, and the cabin felt still and empty. Outside, we found strange symbols etched into the trees around the clearing, twisted circles and jagged lines that didn't look natural. We packed quickly and left, driving down the mountain in silence, the radio crackling with static. Weeks later, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams, the whispering voices calling me back to those mountains. The Appalachians are beautiful, yes, but they are also old, older than us, older than the country itself, and they don't take kindly to strangers. Story the end. The sky was bruised purple as we crested the last ridge on our way up the Appalachian Trail. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense tangle of trees that had been our companion for hours. My friends and I had been driving since dawn, chasing the promise of escape from the noise and chaos of city life, seeking the quiet solace that only the mountains seemed to offer. The cabin Daniel had found was supposed to be off the grid, a rustic retreat nestled deep in the wilderness. I don't think any of us really knew what we were getting into. Daniel was the one who had done all the planning. He found the listing on some obscure rental site, a barely maintained cabin owned by an elderly couple who supposedly disappeared years ago. The pictures were grainy and the description was vague, secluded, peaceful, surrounded by nature. That was all we needed to book it. Tessa, Daniel's girlfriend, had been reluctant but eventually agreed after a little coaxing. Jared and his younger brother Chris were pumped for the adventure. I was mostly excited but a little nervous. There was something about those old mountains that always made me feel like I was stepping into a story much older than any of us. The road to the cabin was less of a road and more of a scratched trail through the forest. Our rental SUV bounced over rocks and tree roots, the wheels sliding on loose dirt as we climbed higher. At one point, the GPS lost signal, and Daniel pulled over to consult a printed map, something from the old days, yellowed at the edges. We were officially off the beaten path. When we finally arrived, the sun was nearly gone, and the first stars were blinking through the canopy. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out much of the sky. It looked like it had been there forever. Rough-hewn logs blackened by age, a sagging tin roof with patches of rust, and a porch that leaned slightly downhill. The windows were dusty, the glass mottled with grime, but inside the faint glow of candlelight suggested the place wasn't completely abandoned. The air was thick and cool, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The living room was sparse. An old stone fireplace filled half a wall, a threadbare rug on the floor, and a wooden table scarred with age and use. Dust floated in the air, catching the light from our flashlights and the flickering candles. The cabin smelled like it hadn't been lived in for years, but it was unmistakably a shelter from the wilderness outside. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before darkness fully swallowed the woods. Dinner was a modest affair. Canned chili warmed over the small wood stove, and cold beers from the cooler. We laughed about the spooky vibe of the cabin, poking fun at the creaks and groans as the old structure shifted in the chill night air. It was a comforting ritual, trying to inject humor into the unknown. After dinner, we gathered around the fireplace. The fire sputtered, struggling to catch in the damp wood, but soon crackled to life, sending flickering shadows across the walls. The night outside was alive with sounds, the rustle of branches, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of the wind. It was beautiful, but it carried a subtle menace, like the forest itself was watching. Chris, ever the restless one, decided to explore the small loft bedroom above. He was only 18, but had insisted on coming along, claiming he needed to prove he could handle the wilderness. As he climbed the narrow stairs, we heard the faint scrape of his boots against the wood. A sudden thump echoed from upstairs. We all froze. Probably just the floor settling, Jared said quickly, though his voice betrayed his unease. But the noise repeated, a slow, deliberate scraping sound moving across the loft floor. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and carefully climbed the stairs to check. The loft was empty, the beds unmade but undisturbed. The only sign of movement was the small window cracked open slightly, letting in a chill breeze that fluttered the thin curtains. Nothing here, Daniel called down. Still, none of us felt comfortable. The cabin seemed to grow colder, heavier, as though the very walls were holding their breath. That night, sleep was elusive. I lay awake, listening to the noises of the cabin. The creaks, the groans, the soft thud of something moving just beyond the edge of hearing. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a whispering sound. Not human, but an unintelligible murmur drifting through the room like a secret conversation. I strained to listen, but it faded quickly, leaving a heavy silence. The next day, we explored the surrounding woods. The trails twisted through dense underbrush and towering trees, some so old their bark was cracked and gnarled like the hands of the earth itself. We found strange piles of stones arranged in circles and bundles of twigs tied with frayed rope, markers left by someone or something. Chris joked about witches or local legends, but his laughter was thin, lacking conviction. Back at the cabin that evening, the atmosphere had changed. The shadows inside seemed deeper, and the fire in the hearth sputtered despite our efforts. As darkness fell, a low scratching sound began outside the cabin walls, slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter like unseen fingers tracing the logs. We gathered inside, doors locked and windows shuttered, but the scratching persisted, relentless and maddening. Then came the knocks, 3 heavy raps on the front door. No one spoke. The knocking came again, louder this time. Then a voice, gravelly and low, whispered through the cracks. "Let me in." Tessa whimpered, clutching Daniel's arm. "Don't open it," Jared whispered fiercely. The rocking chair by the fireplace, which had been still all evening, began to move on its own, scraping against the floorboards with increasing speed. And then suddenly everything stopped. The knocking, the voice, the rocking, gone as if they were never there. When dawn finally broke, the fallen tree blocking the road was mysteriously gone. We left that cabin and those woods behind, carrying the weight of something we couldn't explain, but would never forget. Years later, I still wake in the middle of the night, hearing the creak of a rocking chair, the faint whisper of voices, and that same low voice begging to be let in. Story the end. The road into the mountains was one of those winding, twisting stretches that seemed to devour your car whole, climbing and dropping as it weaved through ancient oaks and maples, their leaves rustling faintly in the humid late summer air. I hadn't been up in the Appalachians since I was a kid, tagging along with my uncle on hunting trips or camping weekends, but this time it was different. I was on my own, a decision born from months of wanting to escape the buzz and noise of city life, the relentless grind of my job, and the quiet dread that had been creeping in during sleepless nights. I needed a place to disappear. The cabin, as my cousin Jake had told me over the phone, was the perfect spot. "It's old, yeah, but it's got character," he said with that half-joking drawl, "and it's all yours for the week." The cabin was supposedly owned by our family for generations, a relic from a time when people carved out lives from these hills with little more than grit and determination. Jake said it had been abandoned for years. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and whatever the forest provided. I'd pictured it as a rustic getaway, a place where I could read, hike, and maybe get some clarity. The kind of spot that seemed charming on Instagram, with cozy fires and deer peeking through the trees. The last turnoff was unmarked, just a rutted dirt trail hidden behind a copse of birches and thick underbrush. My car struggled along, scraping the undercarriage against exposed roots and loose rocks. I parked when the path became too narrow to continue and slung my backpack over my shoulder. The air felt cooler here, but thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. I hadn't seen another soul for hours, and the only sounds were my boots crunching dry leaves and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. The cabin came into view suddenly, a squat silhouette against the green backdrop, its weathered timber darkened by decades of rain and sun. The porch sagged, its beams crooked and splintered. The windows were dusty, some cracked, others boarded up with uneven planks. The roof looked like it might cave in at any moment, but there was a stubbornness to it, like it was clinging to survival despite everything. A rusted metal bucket sat near the front step, and a faded, cracked rocking chair lay tipped over beside the doorway. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood, earth, and something else, a faint, acrid scent that made my skin crawl. The room was small, just one main space with a low ceiling and a narrow stairway leading to a loft. Dust floated in the shafts of late afternoon light filtering through the grime. Spiderwebs stretched across corners and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I dropped my pack and began unpacking, lighting a small camp stove I'd brought for heat and cooking. The first night was uneventful, though I found it hard to settle. Every snap and creak outside made me jump, and the walls seemed to whisper in the wind. Somewhere deep in the forest, a barred owl called, its mournful hoot echoing through the night. On the second day, I decided to explore further. Jake had told me about an old mining trail a few miles from the cabin where you could find rusted tools and abandoned shafts from the 19th century. I packed some water and a flashlight and set out before dawn, eager to make the most of the fading summer light. The trail was barely a path, mostly a corridor through dense underbrush and towering pines where the sun struggled to break through. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like the forest itself was alive and aware of my presence. I stopped a few times, turning slowly, scanning the shadows. Nothing but trees and rocks. After nearly an hour, I came to the first remains. A rusted pickaxe, half buried in moss and leaves, a collapsed wooden frame marking the entrance to a mine shaft that had long since caved in. There was a strange stillness here, as if the earth had swallowed all sound. I took a few pictures and moved on, trying to shake the chill that had settled over me. That night, the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a faint scraping at the windows, the sound of something brushing against the porch railing. I told myself it was animals, raccoons or squirrels moving about, but the sounds grew louder as darkness fell, more deliberate. I sat frozen on the floor, the beam of my flashlight sweeping the dark corners of the room, heart pounding. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp raps on the wooden door, spaced evenly, echoing in the silence. I stared at the door, sweat beading on my forehead, unable to move or respond. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found footprints outside, too large and deep to be any normal animal. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. I followed them for a bit, but they vanished near a cluster of thorny bushes. When I returned, the cabin door was closed, but the padlock I'd left hanging on the latch was gone. I swore I'd locked it. On the third night, the presence made itself impossible to ignore. The cabin felt like a trap. The air was heavy and thick, as if saturated with something unseen. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath coming out in frosted clouds despite the late summer heat. Shadows seemed to lengthen and flicker at the edges of my vision. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing just beyond the walls. The floor creaked overhead in the loft as if something large and heavy was moving above me. I dared to climb the stairs, heart hammering in my chest. The loft was empty, save for a thin layer of dust and broken beams. But as I swept my flashlight across the floor, I saw scratches, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone or something had been clawing at the surface from underneath. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine as I noticed a faint figure standing just beyond the doorway, blurred and pale. I blinked, and it vanished. Panic flooded through me, and I stumbled down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I grabbed my pack, deciding right then to leave at first light. That night, I sat in the cabin's main room, flashlight in hand, ears straining. The sounds didn't stop, whispering voices just out of reach, a scratching like nails on wood. The walls seemed to close in, shadows twisting into shapes that lunged and receded. At one point, the porch light flickered. But I had no electricity. A silhouette appeared in the window, face pressed close to the glass, pale eyes gleaming. I screamed, scrambling back, but when I dared look again, the window was empty. The storm came before dawn, fierce winds tearing through the trees, rain pounding the roof in relentless sheets. The cabin shook and groaned, the power of the tempest filling every crevice. And then, in the midst of the storm, the door creaked open, swinging on its rusty hinges. Frozen, I watched as a dark shape stepped inside. It moved slowly, deliberate, with a gait that was wrong, too stiff, like a puppet on strings. It carried no face, just a blank void where eyes and mouth should have been. It raised a hand, long fingers ending in talons, and reached toward me. I screamed and bolted, slipping on the wet floorboards, bursting out the door into the raging storm. The forest seemed to close around me, branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I ran blindly down the trail, heart pounding, lungs burning. After what felt like hours, I reached my car. The engine roared to life as I slammed the door shut and peeled back down the mountain road, the cabin disappearing behind me like a nightmare. I never went back. Weeks later, I told Jake everything and expecting him to laugh or shrug it off. But his face went pale, and he said only, "You weren't supposed to find the cabin, not really. Some things in these mountains are better left alone. Our family learned that the hard way." I asked him what he meant. He told me stories, old tales about settlers who vanished without a trace, strange disappearances, warnings carved to trees, about a presence that haunts the ridges, something ancient and malevolent tied to the land itself. I don't know what I encountered in that cabin. I only know it changed me. The nights since have been plagued with shadows, whispers at the edge of hearing, and the cold touch of something unseen. Some nights, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear footsteps on my porch, slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the walls. Story the end. The first time I heard about the cabin in the Appalachians, it was from a coworker, Mike, during a late-night shift at the gas station. He spoke in a low, serious tone that caught my attention despite the tired haze that usually blanketed those conversations. "You ever heard about that cabin down near Elkins?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Nobody stays there more than a weekend. Folks say weird things happen." I shrugged it off as just another local legend. Mountain towns always had their ghost stories and warnings, but something about Mike's voice made me remember. Months later, when my friends and I were planning a summer trip to get away from city noise, I brought it up. To my surprise, they were intrigued. We were 4 in total: me, Sarah, Jason, and Matt. None of us were into camping or roughing it, but the idea of a secluded cabin in the Appalachians sounded like an adventure, something different from the usual beach trips. Jason found the listing online, a small wooden cabin nestled deep in the woods near a little mountain town that had about as many people as cars. The rental price was low, which raised eyebrows, but we figured it was just off-season. When we arrived, the sun was dipping low behind the ridges, throwing long shadows over the gravel driveway. The forest was thick and quiet, in a way that felt unnatural. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, with dark logs stained by years of weather. The porch sagged slightly, and the windows were dirty with dust and spider webs. A rusted mailbox near the road had the number 47 barely visible. Opening the front door, the smell hit us immediately. Damp wood, mustiness, and something faintly metallic. The interior was sparse. A threadbare couch, a rickety dining table, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a fireplace blackened with soot. The bedrooms were cramped, the floors creaking with every step. We settled in quickly, eager to set up and explore before nightfall swallowed the forest completely. As we unpacked, Sarah found a faded journal tucked under a loose floorboard by the fireplace. The leather cover was cracked and the pages inside yellowed with age. Curiosity got the best of us, and we gathered around the table to read a few entries. The journal belonged to a man named Elijah, who had lived in the cabin back in the 1930s. His writing was erratic at times, filled with ramblings about things in the woods and watchers in the night. One passage caught my eye. "The forest breathes differently here. Shadows move where they shouldn't, and the silence is broken by whispers that no one else can hear. I fear what lingers beyond the trees. If you find this, do not stay past the 3rd night." A chill ran through me as I read it aloud. Jason scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. "Old man's ramblings. We'll be out before 3 nights anyway." We laughed it off, but as the night settled in, the atmosphere shifted. The first night was mostly uneventful, though sleep came fitfully. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest, owl hoots, the snap of twigs, kept me alert. At around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint tapping sound on the window beside my bed. Heart pounding, I sat up and shined my flashlight out, but only saw the blackness of the trees. "I must be imagining things," I whispered to myself. The next day, we went hiking along a nearby trail that wound through dense woods and over rocky outcrops. The beauty was undeniable. The moss-covered stones, the rushing streams, but there was a weight to the air, like the forest was holding its breath. We noticed several old rusted signs warning of private property, yet no fences or clear boundaries. When we returned, the cabin felt colder somehow. Sarah mentioned seeing a shadow move just beyond the tree line, but when we looked, nothing was there. Matt joked about mountain ghosts, but even he looked unsettled. Night 2 brought more disturbances. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin's timbers. Around midnight, a low whistle floated through the air, eerie and dissonant. We gathered in the living room, lighting every candle and lamp we could find. "Probably just some guy out hunting," Jason said, though his voice was tighter than usual. Suddenly, the porch door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. We jumped, instinctively looking at the windows and doors for any sign of an intruder. Nothing. The forest was still except for the whisper of leaves in the wind. Then, from somewhere outside, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, slow, deliberate, around the perimeter of the cabin. We held our breath, the noise circling and stopping just outside the front window. I wanted to scream or bolt, but my body was frozen. The footsteps vanished as suddenly as they had come. We locked every door, barricaded the windows as best as we could, and sat together in silence, waiting for dawn. On the third day, tensions were high. None of us wanted to stay, but Jason insisted we'd make the most of the time. He suggested exploring an old mine shaft nearby, said it was supposed to be safe. We hiked out, the canopy thickening overhead until it blocked most of the sunlight. The mine entrance was a jagged hole in the hillside, boarded up with rotten planks. We pried one loose and shone flashlights inside. The darkness swallowed the beams, and the air smelled sour. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was breathing and watching. We didn't stay long. Back at the cabin, as evening crept in, strange things began to happen more rapidly. The lights flickered, cutting out several times. The fireplace, which we had kept lit, suddenly went cold despite the wood still burning. Our phones showed no signal, even though the listing had promised minimal reception. Then came the voices. At first, we thought it was radio interference, or perhaps sounds carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably human voices. Whispers in the corners of the rooms, calling our names, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. Sarah swore she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Matt claimed something brushed past his arm in the hallway, but when he turned, nothing was there. Fear began to fracture our group. Arguments broke out over whether to stay or leave. Jason, increasingly agitated, insisted we had to finish the night and leave at dawn. That night, the voices grew louder. Doors slammed open and shut on their own. Cold spots moved through the rooms like unseen hands. At some point, I woke to find the journal open again, this time on the floor beside my bed, its pages flipped to a new entry. They come closer as the nights grow long. The watchers, the shadows. I tried to leave, but the forest does not let you go. Panic overwhelmed me. I shook Jason awake and urged we leave immediately. The others, now terrified, agreed without hesitation. As we rushed to pack, the cabin seemed to resist. The front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The windows frosted over with ice despite the summer heat. The whispering voices crescendoed into agonized screams. Desperate, I threw my shoulder against the door until it burst open. We spilled outside into the night, gasping for air. The forest was alive with movement. Shadows darted between trees, eyes gleaming in the darkness. The whistle returned, haunting and relentless. We ran down the gravel road, not daring to look back until we reached the highway. Only then did the sinister sounds stop, fading into silence. We never returned. The cabin listing disappeared online, and the local tourism office denied any knowledge of it. Friends joked we had experienced a classic case of cabin fever. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the pines just right, I swear I hear that whistle again. Low and haunting, echoing from the Appalachian woods, a reminder that some places hold on to their secrets and they never want to let you go. Story the end. The drive had been longer than I expected. I left Knoxville just as the sun was climbing high in the sky, winding up narrow, twisting roads that cut through the thick Appalachian forests. The kind of trees that seemed to grow right out of the earth, tall and unyielding, their branches intertwining so densely that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The map on my phone showed a small blue dot hopping closer to my destination, a remote cabin tucked deep in the mountains near a little town called Elkmont. I was looking forward to this solo trip, a break from everything, the noise, the endless scrolling, the phone calls I didn't want to take, just me, a stack of books, some supplies, and the promise of peace. But as the hours passed and the road turned to gravel, my excitement began to bleed into unease. The trees seemed to grow thicker, the road narrower, and the sky above darker. Not from clouds, but the weight of the forest closing in around me, like the world was shrinking to this one lonely strip of dirt. I tried to ignore it. I'd spent plenty of time in the woods before. This was nothing new. Eventually, the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and maples, the kind that lose their leaves in autumn and crackle beneath your boots. The cabin itself was simple: weathered logs darkened by years of rain and sun, a stone chimney that looked like it had seen 100 winters, and a porch with a few old rocking chairs and a rusty lantern hanging from a beam. The smell of damp wood and moss filled the air. I pulled up beside it and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate and absolute, broken only by the distant call of a crow. No wind rustled the leaves. No birds chirped. Even the usual creaks and groans of a forest seemed muted. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I stepped out, stretching after the long drive, and noticed something odd. The front door was cracked open just a few inches, enough to see a sliver of the dim interior. My pulse quickened. The rental listing had said the cabin was cleaned and locked up between stays. I looked around, but saw no sign of anyone. I called out softly, "Hello?" but my voice vanished into the trees. No reply. I forced myself to push the door open wider and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood, damp earth, and something faintly metallic underneath. The main room was small and bare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty. A threadbare rug lay on the floor, a battered wooden table pushed against another wall with 2 chairs. On the table was an old-fashioned oil lamp, covered in dust. I set my bags down and went to close the door. It clicked shut, but the lock was broken, the bolt barely catching. I jiggled it, but it wouldn't hold. I sighed and figured I'd have to be careful. Despite the chill, I started unpacking, setting up my little camp. Candles, blankets, a bag of groceries. The quiet was almost unnatural. Every sound I made, my footsteps on the wooden floor, the creak of settling logs, the rustle of fabric, seemed amplified. As night began to fall, the shadows grew long and deep. The sun slipped behind the ridges of the mountains, and darkness engulfed the cabin. I lit the oil lamp and settled into a chair by the fireplace, hoping to shake the creeping unease. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails gently knocking on the window pane. I froze. The cabin had 4 windows, all dusty, all closed. I got up and approached the nearest one slowly. Outside, the thick woods stretched endlessly, black silhouettes of tree trunks and branches. Nothing was there. No one. No animal. The tapping stopped, and I blinked, telling myself it must have been a branch swaying against the glass. I returned to my seat, heart still racing. Minutes passed, then a soft, whispering sound came from the corner of the room, like the fluttering of cloth or a breath close by. I spun around, shining the lamp's light into the shadows. The corner was empty, just the bare wooden walls. I forced a laugh at my own nerves. I was alone, in an old cabin surrounded by forest. Of course I was spooked. I decided to head to bed early. The loft was up a narrow ladder in the corner, a small space with a mattress and a blanket. As I climbed up, the floorboards groaned beneath me, and the cabin seemed to exhale a deep, hollow sigh. I lay down, trying to calm my thoughts, but the silence was oppressive. Just as I was drifting off, a sudden sound jolted me awake, a loud banging against the front door, sharp and violent, as if someone was pounding on it with a fist. My breath caught. I sat up, listening hard. There was no wind, no storm, no animals that could make such a noise. Again, bang, bang, bang. I scrambled down the ladder, heart pounding, and rushed to the door. My hands trembled as I gripped the handle and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the empty night, the black forest stretching away in every direction. No footprints, no shapes, no lights. I slammed the door shut and bolted it as best I could, my hands slick with sweat. For a long moment, I just stood there, chest heaving. Then a voice, low, guttural, almost a growl, whispered from the woods behind the cabin. I couldn't make out words, only the terrible feeling of being watched, hunted. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. I paced, eyes darting toward every shadow, every rustle in the trees. The woods were alive now, humming with something I couldn't name. I sat back down by the fireplace, clutching a heavy stick I'd found outside, and tried to keep my breathing steady. Hours passed. The banging didn't return, but the whispering voice lingered, sometimes close, sometimes far away, always just beyond sight. Finally, exhaustion took me. I woke to a cold gust of air and a scraping sound on the roof. The dawn was just breaking, pale gray light filtering through the windows. I climbed down to find scratches in the wooden beams above the porch, deep and ragged, like claws had torn through the wood. My hands shook as I packed up my things. I couldn't stay another night. As I drove away, the forest swallowed the cabin behind me, but I could swear I saw a pair of eyes glowing in the shadows, watching, waiting. I never went back. Story the end. The road narrowed as I drove deeper into the Appalachian Mountains, the sunlight filtering through the thick canopy of oak and maple trees that lined both sides like silent sentinels. I'd taken this trip to get away from everything. Work, the city, even the memories that had been eating at me for months. My plan was simple: spend a few days alone in a cabin my buddy had rented for me, somewhere off the grid, miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no internet, just silence and the forest. The GPS had stopped working long ago, but I had directions scribbled down on a crumpled piece of paper. Turn left at the old church, follow the dirt road past the creek, then up the hill until the gravel ended. The deeper I went, the more the landscape felt untouched, ancient, like I was slipping backward in time. When I finally crested a small ridge, the cabin came into view. A modest, weathered log cabin with a porch wrapped in faded paint and a crooked railing. The smoke from the stone chimney drifted lazily upward, disappearing into the branches. I parked, stepped out, and took a deep breath. The air was sharp and cool, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. No hum of electricity, no distant car engines, just the quiet rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. This was exactly what I needed, but it was also what I feared. Inside, the cabin was rustic but livable. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a living room with threadbare furniture, and a bedroom with a narrow bed and a single window looking out onto the forest. I unpacked my things slowly, the old floorboards creaking underfoot, and lit a fire in the stove. The warmth chased away the evening chill, but not the lingering feeling that I was being watched. That first night, I lay awake, listening to the forest sounds, the distant howl of a coyote, the snap of twigs, the whisper of wind. Around midnight, something shifted. The creak of the porch steps outside, slow and deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. Shining it out the window, I saw nothing but the empty porch swaying in the breeze. Then a sudden thud echoed from the back of the cabin, followed by a faint scraping noise like claws on wood. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray dog, but the sound didn't fit. It was too heavy, too purposeful. I stood up, grabbing a metal poker from the hearth, and edged toward the back door. The scraping stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed into my ears. I peeked outside but saw only darkness and trees. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night staring into the shadows, every sound setting me on edge. At one point, I thought I saw a figure just beyond the tree line, tall and still, like a statue carved from darkness. When I blinked, it was gone. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear. I took the trail that wound through the woods, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my head. The forest was beautiful but eerie. The trees grew so close they blocked out most of the sky, and the trail twisted unpredictably. After about an hour, I came upon a clearing with the remains of an old foundation, stones stacked haphazardly and half buried in moss. Near it lay a broken rocking chair, splintered and weathered. I felt a chill and hurried back to the cabin. That night, the noises came again, louder and more insistent. Footsteps pacing the porch, slow and heavy, punctuated by sharp knocks on the windows. I pulled the curtains tight, but the knocking circled the cabin, moving from window to window, as if something was going all the way around. The old clock on the mantel, which had been dead since I arrived, suddenly started ticking. It wasn't a normal tick. It was frantic, uneven, like a heartbeat racing in panic. I sat frozen, the poker clenched in my hands, waiting for the nightmare to end. At some point the knocking stopped, but a new sound began, a low, guttural whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out words, only the rasping tone that grated on my nerves. When dawn finally broke, I left the cabin and didn't look back. The drive out of the mountains was slow and tense, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the road like fingers trying to hold me there. Even now, months later, I hear footsteps outside my window at night and the faint creak of a rocking chair on the porch. Story, the end. The car wound its way up the narrow mountain road, the dense forest pressing in on either side like a wall of green. I sat in the passenger seat next to my friend Tom, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the occasional call of a distant bird. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the thick canopy, casting mottled shadows across the dashboard. We were heading to an old cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place Tom's grandfather had owned for decades, but hadn't visited in years. Tom wanted to get away from the city for a few days, to disconnect, to breathe fresh mountain air, and to maybe hear some of those old stories his grandfather had told him about the woods and the things that lurked there. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the trip. I don't like the woods much, especially not at night, but Tom's enthusiasm was infectious. He promised that the cabin was safe, a little rough around the edges, sure, but the perfect spot to unwind. Besides, it was late September, and the leaves were just beginning to turn, the mountains dressed in a riot of reds and golds. It sounded nice, almost idyllic. After about 2 hours of driving, the paved road gave way to a gravel track, and the car slowed, bumping over rocks and ruts. The trees seemed to close in tighter as we climbed, and the sunlight dimmed further. Finally, the cabin appeared through the trees, a squat, weather-beaten structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Tom parked the car and we stepped out. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. The silence was striking. Not the peaceful kind, but a thick, heavy silence that seemed to absorb every sound. I felt it immediately, a weight pressing down on my chest. The cabin's door creaked as we opened it, revealing a small room cluttered with old furniture and dust. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, cold and unused. Tom flipped a switch on his phone's flashlight, illuminating a narrow staircase leading to the loft above. There was no electricity, no running water, just the bare essentials. We set down our bags and began unpacking. Tom built a fire in the hearth, and soon the cabin was warm and glowing. Outside, the sky darkened and the woods grew quiet. We ate sandwiches and drank warm tea from a thermos, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the walls. As night fell, I grew restless. There was something about the woods that made me uneasy. The usual forest sounds, chirping insects, rustling leaves, seemed muted or absent altogether. Instead, I caught faint noises, a distant whistle, a soft tapping on a tree outside, the creak of branches swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. We settled in for the night, each of us on an old cot in the loft. The fire crackled below, but sleep was elusive. I kept hearing faint footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. At one point, a soft knock came at the door. When Tom looked outside, no one was there. Around midnight, the whistle returned. 3 low, haunting notes repeated over and over, drifting through the trees. The sound was deliberate, almost like a signal. We huddled together, the shadows seeming to close in around us. Suddenly, a figure appeared outside the window, pale, motionless, and staring in with empty eyes. We froze, heart pounding, until it vanished into the darkness. The rest of the night was a blur of whispered voices, scratching sounds, and a cold that seeped into our bones. When dawn finally broke, we packed our things and left the cabin behind, the forest swallowing it whole once again. I never forgot that trip, or the feeling that something ancient and watchful still lingers in those Appalachian woods, waiting for the next visitors to cross the threshold. Story the end. The Appalachian Mountains had always held a strange allure for me, a blend of wild beauty and an undercurrent of something older, something untouched and unknowable. When my friend Dylan invited me and a couple of others to his uncle's cabin deep in those mountains, I jumped at the chance. We all needed a break. Me from the stress of the city, Dylan from work, and the others, Mark and Jess, just from the noise of everyday life. The drive was long and winding, roads narrowing until the pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. Cell service vanished somewhere near the last town, and after that, the only sounds were the engine hum and the trees brushing against the truck windows. As we climbed higher, the sun dropped behind peaks, turning the sky a bruised purple. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines. It was an old log structure, weathered and worn. The roof sagged in places, the porch leaned, and the windows were streaked with grime. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, promising warmth inside. Despite the beauty of the place, there was an unsettling quality to it, as though the cabin had secrets it wasn't ready to share. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of old wood and something faintly sour. The floor creaked underfoot, the furniture was simple and rough-hewn. There was no electricity, only lanterns and a small wood stove. We unpacked and lit a fire, trying to shake the quiet that seemed to press in from outside. Night came fast, the darkness absolute beyond the window panes. We sat around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, but the shadows seemed to flicker in unnatural ways. Then came the tapping, soft, deliberate, coming from the window near Jess's sleeping spot. Tap, tap, tap. We froze, eyes darting to the glass. Outside, the forest held its breath. No rustle of branches, no animals. Just the slow, rhythmic tapping. The next morning, long scratches marred the wood around the window, gouges deep and ragged. No animal we knew could have left those marks. The forest was strangely silent during our hike, devoid of bird song or insect calls. At one point, we found footprints, small, oddly shaped, and leading toward a hollow we dared not enter. That night, the tapping grew louder, moving from window to window, accompanied by a low, rasping whisper, "Let me in." We barred the doors, but the scratching turned frantic, hammering against the logs. The fire sputtered, flickered, and died, plunging us into darkness, broken only by our terrified whispers. When dawn finally arrived, we found deep claw marks across the porch and shattered glass where the windows had been. We left the cabin behind, the mountain shadows seeming to close around us as we drove away. Sometimes, long after, I still hear that tapping, 3 slow knocks, echoing in my mind. Waiting. Story the end. The sun had already begun its slow descent when I finally reached the gravel road that led deep into the Appalachian Mountains. The sky was streaked with amber and violet, casting long shadows over the rugged hillsides that stretched out as far as I could see. I was supposed to be meeting my friend Jake, who'd inherited an old family cabin tucked away in one of the more remote hollows of North Carolina. The plan was simple. Spend a weekend unplugged, away from phones, Wi-Fi, and the noise of the city. Just nature, cold beer, and maybe a little fishing in the creek nearby. The last few miles down the narrow road were rough, barely maintained, flanked by thick forests that pressed in close. Tall oaks and maples towered overhead, their branches knitting together like a natural canopy. Every now and then I caught glimpses of deer darting through the underbrush. The air was thick with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp leaves, mixed with the faint trace of wood smoke from a distant chimney. When I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, I couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. The cabin was old, more than a century by Jake's estimate, a squat log structure with a stone chimney and a sagging front porch. It looked like it had been carved right out of the woods. The windows were dark and grimy, and the door hung unevenly on its hinges. Despite the charm, the place had a weight to it, like something ancient was buried deep beneath its floorboards. Jake wasn't there yet, so I stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of mothballs, old wood, and something faintly metallic I couldn't place. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and dust motes floated in the shafts of fading light. There was an old fireplace at one end of the main room, and a handful of battered chairs scattered around. A wooden table sat near a corner, worn and scarred from decades of use. Everything felt frozen in time, like a house that had long ago stopped living. I unpacked my things quietly, the silence of the cabin pressing in. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere a bird called mournfully. It was getting colder, and the shadows of the forest thickened as the sun dropped behind the hills. When Jake finally arrived, his truck kicking up dust on the gravel road, I was already sitting on the porch, staring into the encroaching dark. He smiled broadly, hauling his gear out. He was older than I remembered, or maybe it was just the rugged mountain air that gave his face an almost weather-beaten look. Jake had grown up here, and the mountains were in his blood. We spent the evening drinking beer by the fire, telling stories and laughing at memories from college. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin, and the night grew colder. Outside, the forest was a black wall of silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant howl of a coyote. As midnight approached, I decided to turn in. The bedroom was small and cramped, with a single bed, a rickety dresser, and a window that overlooked the dark woods. I lay down, but sleep was slow to come. The night was thick with sounds I wasn't used to. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, faint creaks from the cabin itself. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly. The room was cold, colder than before, and there was a strange pressure in the air, like the walls themselves were closing in. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart hammering, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin, passing beneath the porch where I was sleeping. The sound was almost too light to be real, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. I sat up, peering through the window into the dense blackness outside. The flashlight by my bed was dead. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the forest beyond was a wall of shadows. The footsteps stopped. A faint whisper brushed past the window, a breath or a voice saying something I couldn't understand. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Morning felt like a distant promise. The next day, Jake and I hiked down to the creek to fish, trying to shake off the previous night's unease. He laughed off my nerves, telling me the cabin had been in his family for generations and that stories about hauntings were just old mountain superstitions. But that night, things got worse. The generator that powered the cabin's few electrical fixtures sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness as a storm began rolling in. Thunder rumbled through the mountains and rain pattered against the roof. We lit candles and sat by the fire, the flames flickering in the gusts of wind that seeped through the cracks. Around midnight, I heard it again, that slow, deliberate tapping at the window. This time it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it toward the window. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the glass, but nothing was there. Then a cold hand seemed to brush my shoulder. I whipped around, but Jake just shook his head. "Probably just the wind," he said, but I wasn't so sure. The tapping grew into scratching, long, scraping sounds like claws on wood coming from the side of the cabin. Then low voices murmured outside, unintelligible but urgent. The shadows beyond the firelight writhed and shifted, and I thought I saw faces, pale, gaunt, watching us from the tree line. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, we found strange symbols etched into the bark of several trees near the cabin, jagged circles and lines drawn deep and crude like warnings. The footprints around the cabin were small, barefoot, and scattered randomly as if whoever or whatever made them had been pacing or searching. Jake admitted that he'd heard stories from his grandmother about the land, about old curses placed by settlers who had been hanged there, about restless spirits trapped in the hollows, guarding secrets and punishing intruders. He said his family had always tried to stay clear of certain parts of the forest, but now the forest felt like it was closing in. The next night was the worst. The rain hammered down, lightning flashing, thunder cracking like gunfire. The cabin shuddered under the storm's fury. And then came the screams, distant, anguished, human and animal all at once, echoing through the valley. We huddled together, terrified and helpless. Then the power went out. The candles blew out. Darkness swallowed everything. I heard breathing, heavy, ragged, right beside me, though Jake was on the other side of the room. The shadows took shape, figures emerging from the dark, their faces twisted in silent screams, eyes glowing like embers. They moved closer, slow and deliberate, blocking the door. I felt cold fingers brush my skin, icy and insistent. I screamed, and then everything went black. When I woke, dawn was breaking, the storm passed. Jake was gone. The cabin was empty. No footprints, no sign of struggle, nothing except the lingering smell of smoke and decay. I ran from that place, never looking back. I later found out that Jake had disappeared before as a kid for several days in those woods. Locals whispered about the hollers, cursed places where people vanished without a trace, where the dead didn't rest. Some say the cabin is still there, waiting for the next visitor. I never went back. Story the end. The drive up into the Appalachian Mountains was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the humdrum of city life. Just me, my sister Claire, and two of our closest friends, Mike and Jenna. We were all craving something different, something raw and untouched. Jake, Mike's older brother, had mentioned this old family cabin tucked deep in the mountains near Asheville, North Carolina. It was barely reachable by car, surrounded by thick woods, with no cell service and no neighbors for miles. Perfect, he said. Secluded, authentic, a chance to disconnect. The road to the cabin was rough, winding, and steep. We left the pavement behind hours ago, the two-wheel drive Jeep bouncing over rocks and tree roots like it was dodging traps set by the forest itself. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow over the endless sprawl of green mountains layered into the horizon. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and an uneasy quiet settled over us as the trees grew denser, blocking out the fading light. When we finally reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. The place looked like it had been swallowed by the forest. Thick vines curled up the sides of the log structure, and the roof sagged under the weight of years without repair. The windows were dusty and cracked. The front porch sagged, the boards warped and gray with age. No electricity, no running water. Just the raw, wild mountain air and the heavy scent of decay. We dropped our gear on the uneven floorboards inside. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 30, with a main room dominated by a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been lit in years. A couple of bedrooms branched off the sides, their doors hanging crooked on rusty hinges. The floor creaked underfoot, and dust motes floated in the beams of our flashlights. The whole place smelled musty, like old wood, damp earth, and something else faint, something almost metallic. We made a fire and cooked a simple dinner over the flames, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease that seemed to settle in the air itself. Outside, the woods stretched endlessly, a living wall of shadows and sound. The night was silent except for the occasional call of an owl and the rustling of unseen creatures moving just beyond the firelight. The first night was restless. Every snap and crack of wood outside made us jump. Shadows danced at the edge of our vision. Jenna swore she heard whispering voices carried on the wind, low and incomprehensible. Mike thought it was just the mountain playing tricks on us. At one point, Claire stepped outside to use the outhouse and came back pale and shaking. She said she thought she saw someone watching her from the tree line, but when she called out, no one answered. We chalked it up to nerves. The second day, we explored deeper into the forest, following old trails Jake had remembered from childhood stories. The trees grew thicker, the path steeper, and the feeling that we were being watched only grew stronger. At one point, I noticed strange symbols carved into the bark of several trees, crude, jagged shapes that looked like warnings or marks. None of us could decipher them. That night, the sounds started. At first, faint scratching at the cabin walls, like nails dragged across wood. Then heavy thudding on the porch, slow and deliberate. We heard footsteps circling the cabin, pacing back and forth in the dark. The whispers came again, closer this time, like a chorus of voices just beyond the window, speaking in a language none of us recognized. The fire flickered and dimmed despite the wood we kept adding. Shadows seemed to gather in corners, moving just beyond the edge of vision. Jenna refused to stay in the main room alone and insisted on sleeping by the fireplace, clutching a kitchen knife. Around midnight, a sharp knocking echoed on the front door. 3 slow raps, then silence. We didn't dare answer. The knocking returned, more urgent, echoing around the cabin, moving from door to window to wall as if something circled the entire structure. The wind howled outside, carrying the strange whispers with it. By dawn, we were exhausted, had eyes bloodshot and nerves frayed. The cabin felt alive, watching, waiting. We packed up as quickly as we could, refusing to stay another night. The hike back down the mountain was tense and silent, the shadows seeming to reach out from the trees, chasing us all the way to the road. When we finally hit civilization, the noise and light felt overwhelming. We didn't speak much on the way home. I still get chills thinking about that place. The feeling that something ancient and restless dwells in those mountains, watching from the darkness, waiting for the next visitor to stray too close. Story the end. The mountains were cloaked in a dense, creeping fog the night I arrived at the cabin. It was late October, the kind of cold that slips under your jacket and settles in your bones. The winding road leading up to the property was little more than a dirt path, flanked by towering pines and ancient oaks, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky like skeletal fingers. I had taken the job for the weekend. A simple gig to watch the place while the owners were away, a remote retreat in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, nestled in a valley that seemed almost untouched by time. The cabin itself was a squat, weather-beaten structure with a sagging porch and windows yellowed from years of neglect. It sat on a slight incline, overlooking a shallow creek that gurgled faintly beneath the weight of dead leaves. When I first stepped inside, the air smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood, though I shrugged that off as imagination. The place was dark, lit only by a small fireplace, and a single dim bulb hanging crookedly from the ceiling. It was rustic, but comfortable enough for the weekend. I unpacked my bag, took a long look around, and lit a fire in the hearth. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees and muting the world into a cold gray silence. My phone had no signal up here, and the power flickered unpredictably. The owners had warned me about the generator. It wasn't reliable. I figured I'd get through the weekend with just the firelight and a few candles. By the time I settled in, it was nearly midnight. I sat in a battered armchair with a book, but sleep kept pulling at my eyelids. Outside, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, soft, hesitant. I looked up sharply, but the window showed only the swirling fog. Must be an animal, I told myself, but my heart pounded in the quiet room. Sleep finally came, fitful and uneasy. In the middle of the night, I woke suddenly, convinced I'd heard someone whispering my name. The cabin was cold, the fire just a low glow in the hearth. I strained to hear, but all was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. I got up to pour myself some water from the kitchen tap. The faucet sputtered and hissed, then ran cold. I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it before bed. The wind must have pushed it open, I thought, but that didn't explain the footsteps or the whispering. Outside, the fog pressed against the porch like a living thing. I stepped out to close the door, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating twisted tree trunks and dead leaves swirling in the breeze. A shadow moved, quick and fleeting among the trees. My breath caught. There was no one else for miles. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon but unease settled like a stone in my stomach. Back inside, I locked the door and drew the curtains tight. Trying to calm down, I settled back into the armchair. That's when I noticed it. On the wall opposite me was a crude painting I hadn't seen before. It was of the cabin itself, but in the image the windows glowed red, and dark figures stood beneath the trees, watching. I had not hung this painting. In fact, there was no other decoration anywhere except an old, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A black and white picture of a family standing in front of the cabin, their faces blurred and indistinct. The night grew colder, the fire sputtering low. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen and pulse with a life of their own. I could feel eyes on me, though I was alone. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. Sleep finally overwhelmed me again, but it was shallow and filled with strange dreams. In those dreams, I was walking through the woods around the cabin, following faint, whispering voices. They spoke in an old Appalachian dialect, warning me to leave. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone was desperate, fearful. When I awoke the next morning, the fog had lifted, revealing the thick forest all around. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and found footprints in the damp earth, small, bare, and human-like. They led from the creek up to the porch, but none led away. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the cabin's shadow. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread. Maybe some local kids had come by to scare me, or maybe the stories about the cabin were just old folklore. I had read about the mountain legends, ghosts of settlers who died in harsh winters, spirits that haunted the woods to protect sacred land. It was easy to dismiss them until the next night. That evening, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into near darkness. I lit candles, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Around midnight, I heard a tapping at the window, slow and deliberate. My heart jumped as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the night. The beam caught something, pale, thin fingers pressed against the glass, just out of clear view in the fog. I froze, barely breathing. The fingers withdrew, and I heard a low, guttural whispering from the other side, just beyond the window pane. The words were unintelligible, but carried an urgent menace. Terrified, I locked the windows and doors, retreating to the fireplace. The flames danced wildly, casting grotesque shadows. Suddenly, the fire flared brightly, then died out completely, leaving me in total darkness. My candles blew out one by one, as if an unseen breath swept through the room. In the suffocating blackness, I heard footsteps, soft, dragging, circling the cabin inside. My breath quickened. I scrambled to find a flashlight, fumbling in the dark. When I finally switched it on, the beam revealed empty space. The footsteps stopped. Then a whisper right next to my ear, "Leave." I spun around, shining the light wildly. No one, only the oppressive silence of the cabin. I knew then I wasn't alone. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear. I didn't dare close my eyes. Dawn felt like a salvation. When morning finally broke, pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, chasing the shadows away. Outside, the forest was quiet, but the footprints from last night had multiplied, surrounding the cabin like a ring. I could swear I saw eyes watching me from the trees, dark, hollow sockets reflecting the morning light. I packed hastily, eager to leave. But as I stepped onto the porch, the ground beneath my feet felt unnatural, cold, like stone beneath the dirt. I bent down and scraped away the leaves, revealing a crude symbol etched into the earth. It was a circle crossed by two jagged lines, something I'd seen before in old Appalachian folklore as a ward or warning. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest and a low moan rising from the forest. It sounded like a chorus of voices, a lament for something lost or trapped. I shoved my bag into the truck, never looking back as I drove down the winding mountain road. The fog thickened behind me, swallowing the cabin and the secrets it held. I later learned from a local historian that the cabin was built on land once belonging to a family accused of witchcraft in the 1800s. They had vanished mysteriously, and the locals whispered of curses and restless spirits guarding the forest. Several previous caretakers had fled after strange occurrences, disappearances, voices in the night, and shadowy figures stalking the woods. I still hear the whisper sometimes in my dreams, a voice warning me to stay away. The cabin in the Appalachians is a place where the veil between this world and the next thins dangerously. The people who vanished never left. They linger in the shadows, waiting. I will never go back. Story, the end. The road up into the Appalachians was narrow, twisting, and lined thick with ancient trees, whose branches arched over the pavement like watchful sentinels. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows that pooled and stretched over the edges of the winding road. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles, a welcome change from the muggy summer heat we'd left behind in the city. My friends Mark, Claire, Jason, and I were heading to a remote cabin tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was Mark's idea. He'd found the listing online, some barely readable ad posted on a local site that boasted seclusion and authentic mountain living. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, a chance to get away from the noise of our everyday lives and disconnect for a few days. I was eager, but also a little apprehensive. There was something about the mountains, their age, their silence, that always made me feel like we were stepping into a different world. We left the main highway behind and followed a gravel road that grew narrower and rougher as we climbed higher. Our old SUV bounced over rocks and potholes. The trees closed in tighter and cell service vanished almost instantly. By the time we pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, the last bits of daylight were slipping away. The cabin looked like it had been lifted straight from an old postcard. A simple, two-story log structure with a sagging roof and weathered shutters that rattled softly in the breeze. Moss covered parts of the roof, and the stone chimney was blackened from years of use. A rusty lantern hung beside the front door. The porch boards creaked under our weight as we stepped out and stretched after the long drive. Mark grinned wide. "Welcome to paradise," he said, slinging his backpack down. Claire wrinkled her nose. "More like a haunted postcard," she joked, though her eyes darted nervously toward the dark forest edges. Jason was quiet, standing with his hands in his pockets and staring into the tree line. I caught him twitching his head like he'd seen something move out there. Inside, the cabin was cool and smelled of wood smoke and mildew. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet. There was an old fireplace with a rusted grate, a small kitchen with peeling cabinets, and a rickety table that looked like it might collapse if you leaned on it. Upstairs were two small bedrooms with threadbare quilts and cracked windows, one of which was partially boarded up. There was no electricity, no cell service, and no running water, just a well outside and a bucket for the toilet. Exactly as advertised. That first night, we lit a fire in the fireplace and sat around talking and laughing to keep the creeping unease at bay. The sky was clear, and stars spilled like spilled salt across the black velvet overhead. But the deeper the night grew, the more the sounds outside shifted. The soft snapping of twigs, distant howls that might have been coyotes or something else, and the rustle of branches brushing against the cabin walls. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of slow footsteps above me. The cabin's second floor creaked under the weight of someone walking deliberately from one end to the other. Claire, sharing the room, whispered my name, her voice trembling. "I heard it too," she said. Mark laughed softly. "Probably just the old woods settling. This place is ancient." But Jason wasn't laughing. He sat bolt upright, eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling. "That wasn't the wood," he said, voice low. We lay in silence, the footsteps continuing, pacing, stopping, then pacing again. Sometimes they'd come closer to the stairwell, sometimes they'd circle the room. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the sounds stopped. The next day, we tried to distract ourselves. We took a trail that led further into the mountains, hiking for hours beneath the thick canopy. The forest was alive with bird song and the buzz of insects. But the deeper we went, the heavier the air felt. The quiet rustle of movement at the edges of our vision never stopped. Jason pointed out strange marks on trees, deep scratches that looked old and deliberate. We came across the ruins of an old cabin, long collapsed, its stone foundation half swallowed by earth and moss. Nearby, the ground was littered with broken glass bottles and twisted scraps of rusted metal. It felt like the bones of a forgotten life. When we got back to the cabin, the sun was setting and a cold fog was rolling down from the higher ridges, swallowing the clearing in a thick, ghostly blanket. That night, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The fireplace refused to catch, no matter how much kindling we fed it. The lanterns sputtered and dimmed. Then the whispering started. At first, it was just on the edge of hearing, faint murmurs like voices speaking low in an unknown tongue. The words weren't English or anything I could understand. They drifted in through cracks and seams in the walls, seeping into every corner of the cabin. Claire curled into a ball on the floor, shaking and refusing to look toward the windows. The footsteps returned, louder and heavier. They moved upstairs, then downstairs, circling the cabin. The scratching came next, slow, deliberate, nails scraping against wood. Suddenly the front door banged open, letting in a blast of cold air that extinguished the fire and chilled us to the bone. Jason grabbed a lantern and ran outside, shouting into the fog. No reply. No movement. Only silence. The rest of us huddled together, hearts pounding, as the whispers escalated into a desperate cacophony of voices, pleading and screaming. Hours later, dawn cracked the sky and the voices stopped. The fog lifted, and the cabin seemed to breathe again. Outside, strange symbols were carved into the trees surrounding the clearing, circles intertwined with jagged lines. None of us recognized them. We didn't speak much during the drive back down the mountain. The silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. Weeks later, I still hear footsteps above me in the quiet of night. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I catch faint whispers carried on the breeze, calling me back to those mountains, the ancient, restless heart of Appalachia. Story the end. The first time I laid eyes on the cabin, I thought it was picturesque. Weathered logs stacked tight, a chimney leaning but still upright, a porch sagging slightly with age. It had that authentic mountain charm that city dwellers romanticize. My friends and I had planned this trip for months, a weekend retreat in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, far from traffic, phones, and the noise of daily life. We had rented the place through an obscure local listing one of my buddies, Tyler, had found, and though the price was surprisingly cheap, none of us thought much about it. The photos had shown a rustic but cozy getaway nestled in a hollow at the base of a mountain ridge, and that was exactly what we wanted. The drive there was long, winding through roads that grew narrower the deeper we went into the mountains. By the time we turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, the sun had dropped low, and the dense forest canopy swallowed most of the remaining daylight. Pines and oaks leaned in close, branches whispering overhead as though they knew something we didn't. It was silent in a way I wasn't used to. No cars in the distance, no hum of electricity, just the tires crunching gravel and the occasional creak of the old Subaru. When we pulled up, the place looked even older than it had in the photos. The logs were darker, the porch sagged more, and the forest seemed to crowd right up against it, giving the impression that the cabin had been swallowed by the woods. A single oil lamp burned in the window, which was strange because the listing had said there was no electricity. We assumed it was some kind of solar-powered decorative lamp, but when Tyler went to check, he found it was just an old oil lantern, freshly lit. That meant someone had been there. The owner had told us the keys would be under a rock by the steps, and sure enough, there they were. We laughed about the lamp, figured maybe the owner had stopped by to make it feel welcoming, though the thought of someone else being there so recently unsettled me a little. Inside, the air was musty and cool, carrying the scent of damp wood and old ashes. The furniture was simple and mismatched, an old sofa, a rocking chair, a wooden table. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, one with a queen bed and one with bunks, and a loft above. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, blackened with decades of use. As we unpacked, Tyler found a leather-bound journal on the mantel. Its cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and curling. Inside were entries written in shaky cursive, dated from the 1950s through the 1970s. The writer had been a man who lived there year-round, talking about hunting, fishing, and sometimes about the visitors at night. That part made us pause. The entries weren't clear about who or what those visitors were, only that they stood by the tree line and watched without moving. At first we laughed it off. Mountain folk tales, probably bears, or maybe just a lonely old man losing his mind. We put the journal back, built a fire, and started cooking dinner. Night fell fast in the hollow. The trees blotted out the stars, and the fire inside threw flickering shadows on the cabin walls. With no phone service and only a few lanterns for light, the world outside the cabin was impenetrable black. As we ate and talked, we occasionally glanced toward the windows, but the glass only reflected our own movements. Around midnight, when we were all winding down, I stepped out onto the porch for some air. The forest pressed close, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet past the clearing. I stood there listening. No owls, no crickets, no wind, just the creak of the porch boards under my feet and the faint crackle of the fire inside. Then, faint but distinct, came the sound of branches snapping in the woods. Something heavy was moving out there. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped when I turned my head. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a bear, but the way it had halted when I listened, like it knew I was paying attention, sent a chill through me. I went back inside, locked the door, and didn't mention it to the others. The next morning, when the fog lifted, I noticed something strange at the edge of the clearing. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and there were impressions in the mud, footprints. But they weren't shaped like boots or shoes. They were bare, long, and narrow, with toes splayed wide apart. They looked almost human, but not quite right. I crouched down and studied them, but when Tyler came out with his coffee, I stood quickly, not wanting to sound paranoid. We spent the day hiking the trails that wound up the ridge. The mountains were beautiful in that rugged, indifferent way, and though the climb was exhausting, the view from the top was worth it. Still, every so often I felt eyes on me, like something was just beyond the trees, keeping pace. Twice I thought I saw movement, a flash of pale skin among the shadows, but when I looked, nothing was there. That night the unease settled heavier on all of us. The fire burned low, and the woods outside seemed alive with muffled noises, snaps, rustles, faint tapping sounds. At one point, Rachel, the quietest in our group, asked if anyone else had noticed how the woods never seemed to have birds or insects after dark. We all had, but no one wanted to admit it until she said something. The silence was unnatural, oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. We locked up tightly before bed, bolting the door and shuttering the windows. The bunk room was cramped, so I ended up in the loft above, where the rafters groaned when I climbed up. Sleep came in fits. At some point deep in the night, I awoke to a sound, scraping, faint but steady. It came from just below me, near the fireplace. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. The sound was like nails dragging across stone. Then came a soft thump, like something heavy shifting its weight. I leaned over the loft railing, peering down. The room was almost completely dark, except for the last dying glow of the fire. At first I saw nothing, but then I realized one of the shutters on the far window was ajar. I was sure we had closed it. The scraping had stopped, but in the dimness, I swore I saw a shape at the edge of the window. Tall, thin, and pale, its head tilted unnaturally as though studying the room. My throat went dry. I blinked, and it was gone. The shutter creaked as though something had moved away from it. The next morning, I told the group what I thought I'd seen. Tyler laughed and said I'd been dreaming, but Rachel didn't smile. She confessed she had heard footsteps circling the cabin during the night, slow and deliberate, crunching in the leaves just outside her window. No one else admitted to anything, but I could see in their faces that they were shaken too. By the third night, we were all on edge. We decided to sit up late, keeping the fire going, drinking to ease our nerves. Around 2 a.m., just when the conversation had died down, we heard it, clear as day. Knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. We froze. No one moved. The knocks came again, louder this time, echoing through the cabin. Tyler grabbed the lantern and crept to the door, whispering, "Who's there?" There was no answer. He reached for the handle, but Rachel hissed, "Don't!" We argued in frantic whispers, but the decision was made when the knocks came a third time, not on the door, but on the window just behind us. We spun around. The window rattled in its frame, the lantern light throwing our shadows wide across the walls. I thought I saw a face pressed against the glass, white, gaunt, eyes too dark, too deep. Then it was gone, and the woods outside swallowed everything. We didn't sleep that night. By dawn, we were half crazed from fear. We packed up as fast as we could, desperate to leave, but when we carried our bags to the car, something stopped us cold. All around the cabin, in the mud and damp grass, were dozens of footprints, bare, long-toed, circling the cabin over and over as though something had spent the night walking in endless loops. When I bent closer, my stomach turned. Some of the prints were fresh, so fresh that water still pooled in them, and they weren't all adult-sized. Some were small, childlike, scattered among the larger ones. That was enough. We threw our gear into the Subaru and left without looking back. The gravel crunched under the tires, and none of us spoke until the cabin disappeared from view. Even then, the woods felt as though they were following us, those same unseen eyes watching from the trees. We never told the owner what happened. We didn't ask for a refund, didn't leave a review, didn't mention it to anyone outside our group. But I know what I saw. I know what we all heard. And sometimes late at night when the world is quiet and the shadows press in, I think about that cabin, about the pale face in the window, and about the footprints that proved we weren't alone. And I wonder if the cabin is still standing there, waiting for the next group of people who think a weekend in the Appalachians sounds like a harmless adventure. Story. The end. The first time I ever stepped foot in the Appalachians, it wasn't for the scenery, though that's what I told people. I had grown up hearing the old stories from my grandmother about the mountains being alive in ways we couldn't understand, and about how certain cabins should be left to rot because the land they were on was never really abandoned. I never put much stock in folklore. I was from Ohio, a couple of generations removed from the hills, and I thought most of it was just mountain superstition. But when I agreed to join some friends for a weekend away in a cabin deep in the Appalachian Range, I got more than just a taste of those old warnings. I lived them. And it's something I can't ever fully forget, no matter how much I've tried. There were 5 of us in total. My friend Eric had been the one to find the cabin, swearing it was authentic, old-school Appalachian, and tucked away far enough that we wouldn't hear a car or see another person all weekend. That was his pitch. Real wilderness, with a rustic cabin as our shelter, no cell service, and just enough supplies to last a few nights. I didn't realize until we got there that rustic was just his nice way of saying falling apart. The drive itself was long and winding, up roads that narrowed until they felt more like trails. On either side of us were towering trees, old-growth forest with trunks thick as telephone poles, and a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. It was beautiful, sure, but there was a heaviness to it too, like the woods were swallowing the road whole. By the time we reached the turnoff for the cabin, I noticed the air felt cooler, the light dimmer, even though the sun was still high. The cabin was about a quarter-mile off the main road, though calling that dirt path a main road was generous. We had to lug our bags by foot because Eric's truck would have gotten stuck if we tried to drive closer. The first sight of the place gave me pause. It wasn't just rustic, it looked forgotten. The roof sagged in places, and the porch was crooked, with boards warped from years of weather. The windows were dark, some of them cracked, and the whole place leaned slightly to the left, as if it was tired of standing. "Man, this is perfect," Eric said, grinning like a kid. He dropped his backpack with a thud and stretched. "This is what I'm talking about, authentic Appalachian living." "Authentic tetanus," my other friend Rachel muttered. She wasn't wrong. We got inside after some effort with the swollen door. The interior smelled of damp wood and old ashes, like no one had set foot there in years. There was one main room with a fireplace, a couple of small bedrooms, and a loft above that looked too unstable to hold any weight. Dust coated everything, and cobwebs hung in the corners like curtains. But it was shelter, and with some sweeping and a fire going, it started to feel a little less foreboding. That first night, it was almost fun. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed about how creepy the place looked from the outside. We were city kids playing at being frontiersmen, and the remoteness only added to the novelty. But when night fell, the woods outside changed. There's a kind of silence in the Appalachians that doesn't exist anywhere else I've been. It's not empty. If anything, it's too full. You hear the distant hoot of an owl, the snap of branches, the shuffle of something in the underbrush, but all of it feels close, like it's just beyond the edge of the firelight. We stayed up later than we should have, drinking and talking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. At some point past midnight, I stepped outside to relieve myself. The air was cold, my breath fogging in the dark. The trees loomed black against the sky, blotting out most of the stars. That's when I heard it. Something moving out there. Not a deer or a small animal, but heavy, deliberate steps, pacing just beyond where I could see. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin against the weight of the forest. The steps stopped. I waited, my skin prickling, but nothing answered. Finally, I hurried back inside, telling myself it was just an animal. When I mentioned it to the others, Eric waved it off. "Probably a bear or something," he said, yawning. "Don't sweat it. That's the whole point of being out here. We're not in the city anymore." But I couldn't sleep easily after that. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified. Every gust of wind against the boards sounded like something pressing closer. The next day we hiked. The woods were beautiful, no denying that. We followed a trail that wound along a ridge, giving us a view of the rolling mountains stretching endlessly. The leaves whispered overhead, and the air smelled of earth and pine. Still, there was a strange quality to it, like we were being watched from the trees. At one point, Rachel stopped and frowned. "Do you hear that?" she asked. We all paused, listening. There was nothing but the rustle of leaves. "I swear I heard someone talking," she said quietly. We shrugged it off, but I noticed how often she kept glancing over her shoulder after that. That evening, when we returned to the cabin, we found the front door slightly ajar. None of us remembered leaving it open, but Eric insisted the warped door probably didn't latch right. Inside, though, something was different. A chair that had been tucked under the table was pulled out. A pile of dust near the fireplace had been disturbed, like someone had walked through it. We joked nervously about the place being haunted, but no one laughed very hard. That night, the noises started. At first, it was scratching along the outside walls, faint enough that we thought it might be tree branches. Then came the thuds on the porch, heavy enough that the old boards groaned. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the sound of footsteps moved slowly around the cabin. At one point, I swear I heard breathing outside the window by my bed. Low, steady, human. I didn't move. I barely breathed myself, afraid that if I shifted, whatever was out there would know I was awake. In the morning, we found prints in the dirt outside. They weren't boots, but bare feet. large, wider than mine, and spaced out in a way that suggested whoever made them had been pacing around the cabin all night. We argued about it over breakfast. Probably just some local messing with us, Eric said, though he didn't sound as confident as usual. Messing with us? Out here? Rachel snapped. There's nothing for miles. Who the hell would hike all the way out here barefoot in the middle of the night? None of us had an answer. We should have left then. But Eric convinced us to stay. He said we'd driven too far to cut it short, that we were just spooking ourselves. He was always the type who hated backing down, even when he should have. That third night was worse. Much worse. It started the same. The footsteps outside, circling, pausing near the windows. But this time there were whispers, faint, broken, like voices carried on the wind. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then Rachel sat up, wide-eyed. You hear that too? She whispered. We all listened. The voices were too low to make out words, but there was a rhythm to them, like chanting or murmuring. They moved around the cabin, overlapping, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never fully gone. Then came the knock. It was deliberate, slow. 3 knocks on the door. The sound echoed through the cabin, and all of us froze. No one moved. No one spoke. After a long silence, the knocks came again, harder this time. Eric, stubborn as ever, grabbed a flashlight and stormed to the door. Who's out there? He yelled, throwing it open. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the empty porch. He stepped outside, sweeping the light back and forth, but the woods swallowed it whole. That's when we heard it from the opposite side of the cabin. More knocks, this time against the back wall. We panicked. Eric rushed back inside and bolted the door while Rachel started crying. The whispers grew louder, circling faster until it felt like they were all around us. The fire in the hearth guttered, shadows jumping across the walls. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me because I don't remember falling asleep. But when I woke, the cabin was silent again. The others looked as shaken as I felt. We didn't even talk about staying longer. We packed up and left that morning, hiking back to the road in tense silence. None of us looked back at the cabin. But as we were leaving, I noticed something carved into one of the porch posts. It hadn't been there before, I was certain of it. The words were crude, jagged, scratched deep into the wood. Leave. I don't know who or what left it there. I don't want to know. All I know is that whatever those stories my grandmother told me were based on, they weren't just superstition. The Appalachians hold things older and darker than we can understand. And some cabins aren't meant for visitors. I've never gone back. I won't. Story the end. The first time I ever set foot in the Appalachian Mountains, I remember thinking it was a place that felt older than time itself. The rolling ridges, the heavy forests, and the strange mists that clung low in the valleys had a way of making you feel like you were trespassing on land that didn't belong to you. People talk about the beauty of the mountains, and that's true. But there's something else there too, something quiet and unsettling, like the hills are watching you. I had driven down from Ohio with 3 friends, Mark, Jason, and Claire, planning on renting a cabin deep in the mountains for a long weekend. Mark had found the place online through a local listing, not even a proper rental site, just one of those word-of-mouth deals you stumble into on obscure message boards. The photos were grainy, almost too dark to make out, but it was cheap, remote, and supposedly right near some good hiking trails. That was all we needed to hear. The drive alone was enough to set a mood. Once we got off the main highway and started winding through those endless 2-lane mountain roads, the world seemed to fold in around us. Tall trees pressed in tight against the road, branches hanging low like they were trying to touch the car. Every so often we'd pass an old house sagging in on itself, porches tilting, windows covered by warped boards, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone inside was watching us go by. The deeper we drove, the less cell service we had. By the time we found the gravel path that led to the cabin, my phone had been dead for an hour. No bars, no GPS, just the road. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. It was larger than I expected, built from old timber logs that had gone gray over the years. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and one of the shutters on the upstairs window was hanging by a single hinge. Mark grinned when he saw it, clapping his hands together. Perfect. Just rustic enough, he said, hauling his bag out of the trunk. Claire wasn't as impressed. She kept wrinkling her nose, muttering about how it looked like the kind of place from those don't go inside horror movies. Jason was quieter, standing by the car with his arms crossed, staring at the tree line as though he'd spotted something moving out there. Inside, the cabin was simple but livable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a sagging couch, and a small kitchen area. The wood floors creaked with every step, and there was a faint smell of damp earth mixed with old smoke. Upstairs were two small bedrooms, each with a pair of twin beds covered in moth-eaten quilts. Everything about the place felt heavy with age, like no one had stayed there in decades. We settled in quickly enough, throwing our bags down and opening a few beers while Mark got a fire going. That first night, things felt almost normal. We cooked, drank, and laughed about how the place was definitely haunted, teasing Claire when she refused to go upstairs alone. But as the night dragged on, the unease started creeping in, subtle at first, then sharper. It was Jason who noticed it. He was staring at the window by the couch when he said quietly, "Does it feel like someone's out there?" We all froze for a moment, the fire popping behind us. Mark laughed it off, but I found myself glancing at the glass too. Beyond the reflection of the firelight, all I could see was black, thick forest pressing in from every side. Claire refused to sleep in her room that night, so we ended up dragging mattresses downstairs into the main room, laying them side by side near the fire. At some point, I woke in the dark to the sound of footsteps upstairs, slow, dragging steps like boots on wood. My heart kicked into overdrive. I listened, not breathing, as the steps crossed from one end of the upstairs to the other. Then silence. I glanced at the others. Jason was awake too, staring at the ceiling, his face pale. Neither of us said anything. We just lay there until exhaustion finally pulled us back under. The next morning, Jason asked if anyone had gone upstairs during the night. We all shook our heads. Mark laughed it off again, saying the place was old, wood settling and all that. But Jason looked unconvinced. I was too. That day, we went hiking along a trail that started near the cabin and wound up into the hills. The woods were dense, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and pine sap. It was beautiful, but there was a constant hum in the back of my mind, like the feeling of being watched hadn't left with the daylight. Claire kept glancing behind us, jumping whenever she heard a branch snap. Around midday, we came across an old foundation in a clearing, just a rectangle of crumbling stone, moss growing thick over it. "Used to be a house here," Jason muttered, crouching to touch the stones. "Burned down a long time ago." "How do you know that?" I asked. He shrugged, not looking at me. "You can tell." None of us lingered long. As we walked away, I could have sworn I heard movement back by the stones, like someone pacing the edges of the foundation, but when I turned, there was nothing. Back at the cabin that evening, things grew worse. The firewood we'd stacked the night before had been scattered across the clearing. Logs rolled far from the pile. At first, we thought maybe an animal had done it, but the wood was arranged almost deliberately, stacked in strange patterns, circles and lines I didn't recognize. Claire refused to go inside until Mark insisted it was nothing, maybe some locals messing with us. But the nearest neighbor we'd passed was miles back down the road. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder this time, moving back and forth across the upstairs rooms, stopping directly over where we lay in the main room. I gripped the blanket so tight my knuckles ached. Jason sat up at one point, staring at the ceiling like he was ready to fight whoever or whatever was up there. But he didn't move. None of us did. Then, around 3 a.m, the front door creaked open. The sound was unmistakable, the long moan of old hinges. Cold air swept across the floor, snuffing out some of the warmth from the fire. I felt Claire clutch my arm, whispering, "The door." Mark scrambled to his feet, grabbing the poker from the fireplace. He yanked the door open and stepped out onto the porch. I followed him, though my legs felt like lead. The clearing was empty. The trees loomed, branches swaying slightly though the air was still. The firewood was scattered again, this time pushed into a large, crooked circle. Mark cursed, slamming the door shut. We dragged a chair in front of it, though deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. The next morning we found tracks in the dirt leading from the tree line to the porch. Bare feet. Dozens of them. some small, some large, pressed deep into the earth like they had been circling the cabin all night. By then, Claire was begging to leave, but Mark insisted we'd be fine, that it was probably just some weird locals messing with us. Jason didn't argue, but he kept glancing at the woods like he expected something to step out at any moment. I stayed quiet, torn between wanting to leave and not wanting to drive those roads in the dark. That night broke us. The footsteps started earlier as soon as the sun went down. The floor above groaned constantly like a crowd was pacing back and forth. Claire was sobbing quietly, curled into herself on the mattress. Then we heard the whispering. At first I thought it was wind pushing through the cracks, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. Voices, dozens of them, speaking low and fast, words I couldn't understand. They seeped down through the walls, surrounding us, filling the room until it felt like the air itself was vibrating. Jason snapped then. He grabbed the lantern, stormed up the stairs, and shouted, "Who's up here?" His voice cracked with anger and fear. We heard him stomping across the floor, opening doors, cursing. Then silence. I held my breath. Seconds stretched on, unbearable. Finally, Jason came back down, his face pale and sweaty. "There's nothing," he said, voice hollow, "but it's cold up there, like a freezer." That was enough for me. I told Mark we needed to leave, now, in the middle of the night. I didn't care. But before we could start packing, the whispering grew louder. The fire sputtered and died, plunging the room into shadows. The front door shuddered as though something was pressing against it from outside. Then came the scratching. From the walls, the windows, the door. Dozens of hands clawing to get in. Claire screamed. We huddled together in the middle of the room, lantern flickering weakly as the cabin groaned around us. I don't know how long it went on, minutes, hours, but at some point it stopped. The whispers faded. The scratching ceased. The air grew still. When dawn came, the tracks were everywhere, circling the cabin, pressed against the walls, smeared across the windows. Always bare feet, always too many to count. We left that morning. None of us spoke much on the drive down the mountain. By the time we reached cell service again, we didn't even bother calling anyone. We just went our separate ways, like pretending it hadn't happened would make it go away. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake to the sound of footsteps above me, slow, dragging steps like boots on wood, and I know the mountains don't forget. Story the end. When I think back on that summer in the Appalachian Mountains, I can still smell the damp wood and hear the echo of wind rushing down through the hollow like a warning that none of us understood at the time. My friends and I had always been drawn to remote places, old trails, and especially cabins that looked forgotten. We used to joke about how the creepier they looked, the better the experience would be. But nothing could have prepared us for the cabin we stumbled across in the mountains of western North Carolina. There were 5 of us, me, my cousin Daniel, his girlfriend Tessa, my buddy Jared, and Jared's little brother Chris, who was only 18 but had begged to tag along. We were all in our 20s, restless and hungry for a trip that would give us stories to tell. Daniel was the one who found the cabin listing online. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything official. It was buried on an obscure website that looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 90s. The pictures were grainy, but it showed a log cabin with a sloping tin roof and a porch that leaned into the hillside. The price was dirt cheap, and the listing claimed it sat deep within the untouched Appalachian wilderness. That alone sold us. The drive out was long, winding, and unsettling. The paved road turned to gravel, then to dirt, and by the time we reached the last stretch, the GPS had given up. We followed a crude set of directions that Daniel had printed out, and every mile felt like we were leaving civilization behind. The trees crowded in thicker, their branches clawing at the sides of the SUV. By the time we pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was sinking, and shadows stretched long across the clearing. At first glance, the place looked older than the photos. The roof sagged a little more, and one shutter hung crooked, creaking in the breeze. The logs were dark, weathered almost black, and the whole place leaned slightly downhill, as though the mountain was trying to swallow it. Still, there was something captivating about it. It had that old Appalachian charm, rough, stubborn, and heavy with history. Chris was the first to hop out of the car, grinning. "This is awesome," he said, his voice echoing too loud in the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and dust. The living room was dim, with only one small window. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, blackened from decades of smoke. A threadbare couch sagged in the middle, and there was a rocking chair in the corner that looked older than any of us combined. The kitchen was tiny, just a sink, a counter, and a few cabinets that clung to the wall at odd angles. There were 2 bedrooms, one downstairs and a loft upstairs with 2 old iron bed frames. We unpacked, joked about who was going to get murdered first in this slasher movie set, and settled in. That first night felt exciting, the way trips always do when everything's still new. We grilled hot dogs outside, drank a few beers, and listened to the night sounds of the woods. The crickets seemed louder here, their rhythm broken now and then by the long, mournful cry of something further off in the hills. It wasn't until the fire died down and we sat in near darkness that we noticed how heavy the silence was between those noises. Back home, even in the country, there's always some hum of civilization, a distant car, a barking dog, the faint drone of airplanes overhead. Here, once the crickets paused, there was nothing, just an emptiness that felt thick, pressing against your eardrums. I didn't sleep much that night. The loft creaked whenever someone shifted, and the wind made the trees groan. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of the rocking chair downstairs moving. At first, I thought it was Daniel or Jared, maybe unable to sleep like me. But when I leaned over the edge of the loft and peered down, the chair was moving by itself in the faint moonlight that spilled through the window. Slow, steady, back and forth. I didn't wake anyone. I told myself it was a draft, or maybe the uneven floorboards settling. Eventually, I forced myself back under the blanket and willed my eyes shut. The next morning, nobody mentioned anything strange. We spent the day hiking the trails that snaked out from the cabin. The woods were beautiful, wild in a way that felt untouched. But there were odd things too. Trees with deep gouges down their bark, like claw marks, and strange rock piles that looked deliberately stacked. At one point, Chris picked up a small bundle of sticks bound together with twine that had been left right in the middle of the trail. "Looks like some Blair Witch crap," he joked, holding it up. Tessa immediately told him to put it back, her voice sharper than usual. Chris laughed but dropped it where he found it. None of us admitted it out loud, but the woods had started to feel less welcoming. The longer we stayed, the more it felt like we weren't alone. That night, it escalated. We were sitting inside after dinner, playing cards at the table. The fire in the hearth had burned low, shadows stretching across the room. Suddenly, there was a heavy thud upstairs in the loft, like someone had dropped a boot on the floor. We all froze, our eyes darting upward. "Probably just the wood shifting," Jared said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. Then it came again, a slow dragging sound across the floorboards directly above us. Daniel stood up, grabbing the flashlight. "I'll check," he muttered. He tried to sound brave, but I could see his hand shaking slightly. We all followed him up the narrow staircase, huddled together like kids. The loft was empty, the beds untouched, but the air up there was colder, and it smelled faintly of rot. Chris swore he saw something move in the corner near the window, but when we shone the light there, nothing was there. We went back down, trying to shake it off, but the mood had changed. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of wind outside set us on edge. That night was worse. I woke again around 3 a.m. to a sound that made my blood run cold. Whispering. It was faint but distinct, like several voices murmuring together just below hearing. I thought it was someone in the room, but when I sat up, I saw Daniel and Jared asleep, their breathing slow and steady. The whispers seemed to come from downstairs, near the fireplace. I lay frozen, straining to hear. The words weren't English, or at least not in any dialect I recognized. They rose and fell in rhythm, like a chant. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep again. I sat up, clutching the blanket, until dawn crept gray through the windows. In the morning, I almost convinced myself it was a dream. But when we went downstairs for breakfast, we saw something that made my stomach drop. The rocking chair had moved. We had left it in the corner, but now it sat directly in front of the fireplace, facing the cold ashes. "Okay, who's screwing with us?" Jared asked, his tone defensive. No one admitted to moving it, and the look on Chris's pale face told me he hadn't been the prankster this time. We decided to leave that day, but the road out was blocked. A tree had fallen across the dirt track sometime during the night, and it was too big for us to move with just our hands. With no chainsaw, no way to pull it, we were stuck until we could figure something out. Our phones had no signal, so calling for help wasn't an option. The unease that had been growing inside the cabin seemed to thicken. That afternoon, while we tried to come up with a plan, Tessa went upstairs to lie down. 20 minutes later, she came back down, shaking and pale. "There was someone up there," she whispered. We all froze. I laid down, and I thought I heard you guys come up. But when I opened my eyes, there was a man standing by the window, just standing there, looking out. He was tall, wearing this, I don't know, like old clothes, suspenders maybe. I blinked, and he was gone. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, but he looked as shaken as the rest of us. That night was the breaking point. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The cabin groaned, and the shutters banged against the walls. We sat together in the living room, too scared to sleep. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scratches on the outside walls, moving slowly around the cabin, like something circling us. Chris gripped the poker from the fireplace, his knuckles white. The scratching stopped at the front door. A heavy silence followed, so thick I thought my heart would burst from the pressure. Then came 3 slow knocks. None of us moved. None of us breathed. The door creaked, the old wood straining, though the latch held. And then we heard it, a voice, low and gravelly, seeping through the cracks. "Let me in." Tessa whimpered, burying her face in Daniel's chest. Jared whispered, "Don't move. Don't answer." The voice came again, louder, angrier. "Let me in." The rocking chair began to move on its own, scraping against the floorboards, rocking violently, and then as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The wind died. The scratching, the knocking, the voice, it all vanished, leaving only silence. We sat there until the sun came up, unable to move. The next morning, the tree blocking the road was gone. Not cut, not dragged, just gone, as if it had never been there. We didn't question it. We packed our things in record time, shoved them into the SUV, and tore out of that hollow without looking back. None of us ever spoke of it again, not really. Daniel and Tessa broke up a few months later. Chris refuses to go camping anymore. Jared still swears it was some locals messing with us, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night, when the world is still and the air is heavy, I swear I can hear it again. The slow creak of a rocking chair, the whisper of voices just below hearing, and a low, gravelly voice at my door saying, "Let me in." Story, the end. The first time I heard about the cabin, I didn't think much of it. My cousin Chris had been talking about this old family property in the Appalachians, a place that had been abandoned for decades and was barely holding itself together. He said it sat near a ridgeline with a dirt road leading halfway up before it turned into nothing but trail, overgrown with vines and brambles. It sounded like the kind of place you'd go if you wanted complete isolation, which was exactly what I needed at the time. Work had been crushing me, my relationship had fallen apart, and I just wanted somewhere cheap and quiet to disappear for a week. So when Chris offered the cabin, I said yes without even asking too many questions. Getting there was more of a struggle than I expected. The drive from my town in Virginia wound deeper and deeper into the mountains, roads narrowing until 2 cars could barely squeeze past each other. I had no cell service for at least 2 hours before reaching the turnoff, which was nothing more than a gravel path with a rusted cattle gate chained loosely at the front. Chris had told me to push it open and drive on through, said no one cared who went up there anymore. The trail was rough, rocks jutting out and branches scraping against my car. After about a mile, the path was too narrow to continue, so I parked and walked the last stretch with my backpack, my cooler, and a flashlight, even though the sun was still high. When I first laid eyes on the cabin, I felt that strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief because it actually existed, because part of me thought I'd find nothing but rubble. Unease because it looked like it should have fallen down years ago. The wood was dark, warped from rain and sun, the porch sagging so badly I thought it would collapse if I stepped on it. Windows were broken, patched in places with crooked boards. The chimney leaned to one side as if it was trying to peel itself away from the house, and yet the front door was shut tight, a thick padlock dangling open as if waiting for me. Chris had said the lock was just for show, that nobody came up here. I pulled it free and pushed inside. The smell hit me first. Mold, damp earth, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The interior was dim even though light streamed through cracks in the walls. Dust lay over everything. There was a table with one leg propped by a stone, a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used since the 60s, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. Animal droppings were scattered across the floor. Still, it wasn't as bad as I'd expected. I cleared a space, laid out my sleeping bag, and told myself I could make it work for a few nights. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked around, cooked some food on a portable stove I'd brought, and read until it was too dark to see. That night, I lay in my bag listening to the sounds of the forest. The mountains are never truly silent. There were crickets, owls, something moving in the underbrush. But around midnight, I noticed a different sound. A steady creak, faint at first, like a board shifting under weight. It came from the porch. I held my breath, straining to listen. For a long moment, everything went quiet again, and I told myself it was just the old wood adjusting to the cool night air. But then I heard it again, longer this time. Someone, or something, was on the porch. I wanted to check, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The walls of the cabin suddenly felt paper thin. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't want to make noise grabbing it. Instead, I lay frozen, heart pounding, until the sound stopped. After what felt like an hour, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The porch boards were damp with dew, no footprints visible. I told myself it had been raccoons, maybe a bear passing by. But as I walked the perimeter, I noticed something strange. The door was shut and latched from the outside. I hadn't done that. I distinctly remembered pulling it shut behind me before bed, but the latch was one you had to hook manually from outside. I stood there staring at it, trying to work through possibilities. Maybe I'd misremembered. Maybe wind or movement had shifted it into place somehow. Still, a chill worked its way into my stomach. Later that day, I decided to hike further up the ridge. Chris had said there were remnants of old homesteads scattered around, stone chimneys standing alone where houses used to be. I wanted to see them, to remind myself that people once lived here, that this wasn't some cursed, forgotten corner of the earth. About 2 miles up, I found one. A collapsed foundation with a chimney jutting out, blackened at the top. There were rusted tools half buried in the dirt, a few broken plates, even a child's shoe nearly rotted through. The place felt heavy, like the air itself didn't want me there. I didn't stay long. By the time I returned, clouds had rolled in. The cabin looked darker against the gray sky, and I had the unsettling impression that it was watching me. That night, the noises came back, only louder. Not just the porch this time, something brushing along the wall outside, circling, every so often a faint tapping against the boards. I gripped the flashlight until my hand hurt, pointing it at the door, though I knew thin light wouldn't stop anything from getting in. Around 3 a.m, there was a sharp knock. Just once. 3 deliberate raps right at the door. I nearly screamed, but I clamped my mouth shut. My body wouldn't move, as if instinct told me pretending to sleep was safer than confrontation. Minutes dragged on, then nothing. When dawn came, I checked outside again. No tracks, no signs, just damp earth and endless trees. By the third night, I was ready to leave. But the road back down was steep, and storms had rolled in heavy. I convinced myself I could last one more night and head out in the morning when it was clearer. That was the night everything changed. The storm hit hard, rain lashing against the roof, wind moaning through cracks. Around midnight, through the noise of the storm, I heard it again, that steady creaking on the porch, louder this time. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps inside the cabin. My stomach dropped. I had locked the door. I knew I had. But I heard it, plain as day, wood groaning under weight, footsteps crossing the floor just feet from me. I shot upright, fumbling with my flashlight, and shined it toward the sound. Nothing. Just empty air, dust floating in the beam. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved toward the stairs. I listened, frozen, as they climbed one by one into the loft above me. Then silence, except for the storm. I didn't sleep. I sat there until the first gray light of dawn filtered in, my flashlight beam trembling on the stairs. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, the loft was empty. Just broken boards and a collapsed cot. No footprints in the dust. Nothing at all. That morning, I packed up fast. My hands shook as I shoved my things into the bag, every creak of the cabin making me jump. When I stepped outside, I noticed something carved into the porch post. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. Freshly scratched, jagged letters. Don't come back. I bolted down the trail, barely caring about the branches whipping my arms. When I reached my car, the relief was so strong I nearly cried. I drove until I got cell service, then called Chris. He was quiet for a long time after I told him. Then he said, almost reluctantly, "Yeah, I didn't want to freak you out before you went, but people around there, they always said that place wasn't right. My granddad's brother died up there back in the 50s, went missing for days. They found him inside that cabin like he'd starved, even though there was food. Said he kept telling folks something was in the loft." I didn't know what to say. Chris told me to forget about it, to never go back. I promised I wouldn't. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my head. The slow climb of something unseen, step by step, into the dark above me. Story the end. It started as a trip meant to be quiet. Nothing more than a week away from phones, noise, and the grind of work. I had grown up hearing stories about the Appalachian Mountains, but they were mostly told with a kind of nostalgia, a reverence for the old woods, the culture, and the raw beauty. My friend Aaron had the idea. He found a listing online for a cabin deep in the hills, just outside a small town in North Carolina. The photos showed a rustic wooden place with a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and a view of the endless ridges that stacked up one after another into the horizon. It was cheap too, almost suspiciously so, but we didn't think twice. Cheap was good. There were 4 of us in total, me, Aaron, his girlfriend Jess, and my younger cousin Tyler. We packed the SUV with more food than we'd ever eat, beer, sleeping bags, and enough firewood to keep us warm if the place turned out draftier than it looked. The drive was long and winding, taking us further and further from anything resembling a highway. The roads narrowed, trees thickened, and cell reception faded to a single bar, then none at all. By the time we pulled onto the gravel road that led toward the cabin, it felt like we had crossed into another world. The cabin itself looked older in person than in the photos. The wood was dark and weathered, the porch sagging slightly, and the windows clouded with age. But it was charming in that rugged way, sitting alone among towering oaks and pines. There were no other houses in sight, no lights on the hills around us, just endless forest. We unloaded and settled in. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and something else. Something damp, like the air in a basement that hadn't been opened in years. The floor creaked under our boots, and though it was fully furnished, the furniture had that mismatched look that said it had all been there for decades. There was a guest book on the coffee table filled with scribbled notes from people who had stayed before. Most of them praised the solitude, the quiet, and the beauty of the stars at night. A few of them, though, had shorter notes, cryptic ones. Strange noises at night, but otherwise wonderful. Keep the porch light on. Don't leave food outside. I remember Tyler chuckling as he read them out loud, saying it was like people wanted to make it sound creepy on purpose. But as night fell and we lit the fireplace, I found myself thinking about those lines more than I wanted to. The woods outside were dark in a way you don't see in towns or cities, the kind of dark that feels heavy, pressing against the windows. The first night was quiet enough. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, drank, played cards, and laughed. When it got late, we spread out in the bedrooms, 2 upstairs and 1 downstairs. I ended up downstairs in the smaller room while the others took the rooms above. I didn't sleep well. The mattress was lumpy, the air was cold, and I kept waking up to faint noises outside. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, things that could easily have been deer or raccoons. But once, around 3 a.m., I swore I heard something that sounded like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. Then nothing. I held my breath and listened, every hair on my body standing up, until eventually sleep dragged me back under. The next morning, I didn't mention it. It felt stupid, like I'd been letting my imagination run wild. Instead, we went hiking. The trails were steep and rocky, and the forest seemed endless, with giant moss-covered boulders, small waterfalls, and the sound of birds echoing through the trees. We didn't see another soul out there, which felt strange, but also freeing. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, We built a fire outside and roasted marshmallows. Jess pointed out how quiet it was. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, not even the sound of planes overhead. Just crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. We were joking and laughing again when suddenly the forest went silent. No crickets, no night calls, just a thick, eerie stillness. "Whoa," Aaron said, glancing around. "That's weird." "Probably a predator," Jess said, though her voice was tight. "Like a coyote or something." Tyler smirked. "Or Bigfoot." But none of us really laughed. The silence stretched on, pressing into us, making every crackle of the fire sound too loud. Then, from somewhere in the trees, there came a noise. Not an animal noise, not exactly. It sounded almost like a whistle. Low, drawn out, rising and falling. We all froze. "Tell me you guys heard that," I whispered. "Yeah," Aaron said. His eyes were wide. We listened, straining to catch it again, but the forest stayed silent. After a few minutes, the normal night sounds returned, like a switch had been flipped. We sat closer to the fire after that, none of us talking much until we finally retreated inside. That night, I woke again. This time, I was sure I heard footsteps. They weren't on the porch. They were inside, on the floor above me. Slow, steady creaks moving across the boards. I held my breath, waiting for someone to come down the stairs, but the sound stopped after a minute. I almost convinced myself it was Aaron or Jess going to the bathroom, until I heard their muffled voices upstairs, both of them still in bed, whispering like they were awake and uneasy too. The next morning, we all admitted we'd heard it. Tyler tried to shrug it off, saying old houses always creak, but his face was pale. Aaron kept checking the locks on the doors, even though they were all still shut. Jess asked if maybe we should leave, but we had already paid for the week, and Aaron was stubborn. "We'll be fine," he said. "It's just the woods getting to us." But it didn't feel fine. The following night, things escalated. Around midnight, we were woken by a loud bang, like something slamming against the side of the cabin. We all jumped up, heart pounding, grabbing flashlights. Aaron flung the door open and shined his beam outside, but there was nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of anything. We checked all around the cabin, but it was empty. When we got back inside, though, something was different. The guest book on the coffee table was open. None of us had touched it. It was flipped to the last page, and there, written in fresh ink, were words none of us had written. "Don't stay past the third night." Jess burst into tears. Tyler swore it was a prank, but his voice cracked as he said it. We checked the pens, checked our bags, but there was no explanation. That night, nobody slept. We sat in the living room with the fire blazing, the lamps on, and our bags half packed. Every sound made us jump. Once the doorknob rattled, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing it from outside. We didn't open it. Hours dragged by like days. Around 4 a.m., we heard the whistle again. This time it was closer. So close it sounded like it was right outside the window. When the sun finally came up, we didn't even talk about it. We just threw our stuff in the SUV and left. As we drove down the gravel road, I looked back once at the cabin. For just a second, I thought I saw someone standing on the porch, watching us go. We never reported it, never told the owners. We didn't want to explain it, didn't want to relive it. But sometimes when I can't sleep at night, I hear that whistle again in my head, low and rising, echoing through the trees. And I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed that third night. Story the end.